Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin here with a huge episode of World War III analysis, episode 132 here of World War Now, where we are discussing the future of the Russia-Ukraine conflict as Donald Trump escalates, threatening to give Ukraine more and more weapons to strike Moscow, claiming the war could likely escalate rapidly if Russia doesn't come to some kind of ceasefire agreement. Meanwhile, Russia advances rapidly on the front line, so it appears we could be in a rapid escalation phase between NATO and Russia. We also have big updates from the Middle East as Israel escalates its genocide in Gaza. Operation Gideon Chariots B is operating in North Gaza as the full annexation continues, as well as Smotrich's E1 plan. All of these, these regions connect, of course, in Azerbaijan as Russia and Azerbaijan turn on each other. The Zangezur corridor heats up, and even Azerbaijani oil facilities in Ukraine aren't safe. Some wondering if this could even signal a break between Russia, Azeri, and even Russian-Israeli relations. Of course, we're going to be discussing Syria and Lebanon as well, as Israel continues to manipulate these countries to expand their greater Israel project. Iran and the E3 countries continue negotiations as Iran's water crisis, political unrest, and internal civil wars effectively heat up. So they're trying to normalize and prevent snapback sanctions as best as they can. Of course, Trump has also deployed major naval assets to Venezuela, the Southern Caribbean. Major destroyers, other ships are now right off the coast of Nicolas Maduro's fortress down there, as he is also calling for Bolivarian mobilization. So major regime change escalations in South America. We're obviously also going to be discussing some church news, the big news about Archbishop Alexei being forced to apologize for his meeting with Putin, as well as some persecution updates from both the Holy Land as well as Ukraine. Of course, we're going to be talking about Africa, some other issues in the Middle East, as well as, again, other church news and a whole bunch of other World War III updates that you're only going to hear here at World War Now. So with all of that, Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad. And of course, we have very interesting news this week on the diplomatic end. There's been, of course, a lot of big, powerful photo shoots. Just like last week, we've had the Anchorage, Alaska meeting between Trump and Putin, the red carpet, the F-35s, the B-2 bombers flying overhead, all very cinematic and beautiful. This week, very similar stuff. We have, of course, the coalition of the willing, of course, all of our favorite Western characters coming together in one room, essentially, this almost like a Marvel superhero gathering, right? We had the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, the British Prime Minister, the French President, German Chancellor, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, of course, Alexander Stubb, the Finnish President, which is very interesting. Notice Finland, one of the newest NATO members, right? And of course, now sharing a huge border of the Russian Federation. Obviously, we know the Finnish military has been mining up the borders up there north in Karelia of Russia, potentially a future military threat given the distance between, of course, Finland, literally NATO's border, and St. Petersburg is about 3 hours by tank. So just consider that. And of course, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was there as well, and Zelensky. And of course, there was even a telephone call between Trump and Putin, which lasted about 40 minutes. It was all very cinematic. And this coalition of the willing was basically trying to hammer out and discuss with Trump exactly what kind of agreements he's come up with Putin and what kind of security guarantees can be made. And these keywords have been thrown around all week. What security guarantees can be given to Ukraine from the Russian Federation? What can Putin actually guarantee for Ukraine in terms of a ceasefire? Maybe the aerial warfare taking place over the skies of Ukraine could be stopped, for example. Like the war could be limited to that only on the ground. The planes and drones constantly hammering at each other's borders could finally cease flying. I think there's all kinds of big ideas being thrown around and lots of disinformation. So this meeting in the White House, I think, eventually was uneventful. But we did see one thing, Conrad, and I think that's either the Vice President Vance or President Trump himself. They've insisted that Zelensky fix up his attitude. And he, in fact, in his 4.5-minute little speech that he gave, he apologized and he actually said thank you to the US 11 times in 4.5 minutes, almost one big thank you every 30 seconds or so. So that's a big change for the first time. So Zelensky has cleaned up his act. And it's very obvious now to me that Donald J. Trump, for the first time, he's even hugged Zelensky. His attitude towards Zelensky has somewhat changed. And again, what exactly has changed? Did Putin give certain guarantees at Anchorage? We're still actually not sure. In fact, this week there's been a lot of speculation from different political analysts as to what exactly took place in Alaska. Why was the meeting between Trump and Putin so amicable and so friendly? What exactly did they discuss? One of the biggest conspiracy theories, and this one was, of course, pushed by some Russian analysts, is that Putin proposed to Trump something that Trump did not expect, that Russia potentially will become America's ally in this future geopolitical confrontation with China. Maybe Russia will provide economic investment opportunities for the US, for US corporations in the development of Siberia, these big futuristic, almost sci-fi-esque projects in the Arctic, in developing the Russian Far East, in opposition to this rising Orient, this rising China, which is well and truly, it seems to be at least, out of the grasp of influence of American and even, shall we say, Zog-controlled politics. It's really kind of a disconnected system in and of itself. And this was one of the theories that in the Russian sphere, people have been throwing around, that Putin gave this proposal to Trump, and this is what caught Trump a little bit by surprise. Another theory was that maybe Putin offered to Trump that, well, the Russians will be content with not taking Zaporozhye and Kherson. And all these various theories have been thrown around. But one of the interesting things was that Steve Witkoff, right? We've spoken about this character plenty of times over the last few weeks and months leading up to these very important peace talks and the ceasefire discussions. And Steve Witkoff threw probably the strangest idea out in relation to the security guarantees. He said that potentially Ukraine will receive something similar to an Article 5 guarantee from NATO and, of course, the US and its allies in terms of protecting its security. Now, what will this look like? Ukraine not being a member of NATO, how can it receive Article 5 guarantees and defenses? I mean, this is so out of the blue and so extraordinary. And Steve Witkoff really didn't elaborate on this. So clearly he either misspoke or perhaps he leaked certain information, which was very much in a draft form, probably proposed by Trump to Putin. Who knows, really? I mean, at this point, we're simply speculating. And Lavrov, of course, throws another wrench in the works. From his own perspective, he, of course, gives an interview and answers certain questions. And in his particular statement, he openly states that Russia's other concerns are, of course, those of the Orthodox Church, of the Russian culture, and the Russian language in Ukraine, especially what kind of freedom do Russian speakers and Russian people actually still retain within an independent Ukraine if these security guarantees are presented by the Russian Federation to this new Ukrainian regime, right? And this is really key. So it seems like Lavrov simply mentions this as an addendum. I think the entire question of the Russian language or even the status of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was probably not discussed by Trump. I doubt this even came to his mind, I think. And this is despite the fact that Putin, of course, met with the Archbishop of Alaska and all these additional meetings took place, but I don't think this was on the agenda. And so it seems to me very much that Russia is trying to buy time, trying to potentially delay some of these talks, delay the inevitable ceasefire discussions. And because we know that in the end, the more land Russia takes, the more leverage, the more advantage it gains over time. And recently, Russia has been making some incredible progress on the front lines. I think this is undeniable. And in terms of local diplomacy with Belarus, with a country like Kazakhstan as well, Putin has made great progress with Tokayev actually in discussing trying to come up with an agreement to use Kazakh oil refineries to try and supply the Russian military with fuel in order to, of course, assist in logistic lines, because the Ukrainians have been hitting Russian oil refineries quite intensely over the last 18 months or so, especially in Western Russian regions. And if you look at the Soviet model of logistics building over the USSR, if the main oil refineries are not just located in Western Russia, you have the two subsidiary zones, Kazakhstan and Belarus, which have major oil refineries of their own, which of course refine crude oil. They turn it essentially into petrol or diesel that can be used by the vehicles, of course, of the Russian military. So, and yes, there has been a petrol shortage, so to speak. Some petrol stations in Rostov-on-Don, for example, Donetsk, Lugansk, not just the drought. Obviously, there's a water crisis happening in Donetsk, Lugansk right now because it's peak summer in August in Europe. But there's also a petrol shortage. Certain petrol stations are, of course, running very low, running very dry. And that's because the Ukrainians are disrupting these oil supply lines. So all these things are very important and discussed. And I think some of the most interesting aspects of all of these diplomatic talks, Conrad, has been the fact that Lavrov mentioned that, well, maybe Chinese peacekeepers will be included in this potential buffer zone security arrangement that's being prepared between Russia, NATO, and Ukraine in the near future. And this will be maybe the first time in human history, maybe since the Mongol conquest, that Chinese troops will set foot on European soil. I mean, I'm just thinking historically speaking, the Chinese have never really sent troops to Europe besides perhaps Genghis Khan when his empire united the Eurasian landmass. So it's a very sort of interesting hypothesis. I wonder if this has anything to do with Lavrov's insistence on the BRICS economic union, or if this is Xi Jinping's personal proposal. We do know there's been a lot of great work with North Korean troops. It's almost now solidified that North Koreans were certainly fighting in the Kursk Oblast. So there's been a lot of big discussions, diplomatically speaking, Conrad. But at the moment, we are in a state of flux. Trump has given Putin a 2-week deadline to set things straight, to arrange a new meeting with Zelensky, and everyone's kind of awaiting as to where exactly this future meeting will take place. So we're very much in this state of undetermined, timely pressure. Again, Trump is giving deadlines. Putin, again, is unsure of where to go, and the Russians are still deciding as to where the next meeting will take place. Everybody's giving proposals, and at the moment, I think we're all watching the news very carefully.
It sort of goes from sounding unfortunate to sounding, like maybe the Russians are really just playing a whole game here, because the idea, of course, that Putin was willing to give up, let alone the territory that isn't currently under Russian control in Kherson and Zaporozhye, for the rest of the Donbass, potentially even being willing to give up what they've already taken. That is a huge concession. And if that really occurred, I think Dmitry and I would make it very clear that we think that is a horrible decision, and that is effectively I would almost describe it as a Pyrrhic victory for Ukraine, considering how Ukraine hasn't controlled most of the Donbass for well over a decade at this point. And if they were to get back Zaporozhye and Kherson, that would definitely be something that I don't think they could achieve on the battlefield, and would thus be a radical mistake for the Russians. But then, of course, like you said, Dmitry, you mentioned the Chinese security guarantees. We see the Russians still advancing in Kharkov, in Zaporozhye, in certain regions, as they hesitate to actually plunge into Zaporozhye city itself. And in the midst of all of this, of course, I think the Russians now, again, if they didn't have the pretext to escalate at this point under the guise that they are the peace-seeking faction, they certainly do now, after they presented the U.S. with this idea. And then Trump responded. This is from Dave DeCamp on antiwar.com about Trump's latest Truth Social posts. President Trump on Thursday suggested he supports Ukrainian attacks on Russian territory in a provocative post, which comes less than a week after his summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin. It is very hard, if not impossible, to win a war without attacking an invader's country. It's like a great team in sports that has a fantastic defense, but is not allowed to play offense. There's no chance of winning. It is like that with Ukraine and Russia, the president wrote. Crooked and grossly incompetent Joe Biden would not let Ukraine fight back, only defend. How did that work out? Regardless of this, a war that would never happen if I were president. Zero chance. Interesting times ahead, Trump said. President Biden gave Ukraine the green light last year to use U.S.-provided missiles on Russian territory, which Russia responded to by altering its nuclear doctrine to lower the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons, underscoring the seriousness of the escalation. The U.S. has also supported drone attacks on Russian territory by investing $1.5 billion in Ukraine's domestic drone manufacturing program, and reports have said that the attacks rely on Western-provided intelligence. Trump's comments come amid talks and negotiations about a potential peace deal in Ukraine, though the conditions being discussed by Ukraine and its European backers make an agreement seem unlikely. Some NATO countries are insisting on sending troops to Ukraine, and Trump has suggested that he supports the idea, but Russia has made it clear it's a non-starter. And of course, we've heard of this talk of a Article 5-like guarantee towards Ukraine without NATO membership, which, as I discussed in my live stream this week, which you can find both at worldwarnow.co, which I encourage everybody to subscribe to, get behind the paywall on Substack. You can also find it on our YouTube channel and our X account. Be sure to like this video as well here on Substack. We're trying to get our episodes over 50 likes here, and we know we're distributed across multiple platforms. But please give us a like here, leave us a comment, and subscribe here on Substack. It really helps us out. But those Article 5 potential guarantees seem like the silliest thing to me, because, the most relevant part of NATO and the treaty is Article 5. That's what, the Russians are. There's other things, of course, to be worried about. But when it comes to Finland and the Baltic states, especially these Baltic countries where Russia does potentially have legitimate security interests, as well as ethnic Russians may have legitimate civilizational interests that the Russian Federation could be able to secure, that's, of course, now a non-starter because of these Article 5 guarantees. And with the Ukrainians not willing to give up territory, with the Ukrainians not willing to give up EU membership, which ironically the Russians were largely okay with, which I think is very silly. If you get them into the EU, if you give them the pseudo-NATO-esque Article 5 guarantees and then much more expanded, energy and mineral deals, this is going to get us exactly the same place that Ukraine's membership into NATO would have gotten us to begin with. So again, the Russians are advancing on the front, so it's important to always keep that in perspective as we witness these sort of theatrical negotiations. But Zelensky is demanding these security guarantees before he ever meets with Putin. And Trump has already punted the football entirely on actually being responsible for any of these territorial swaps. So it's effectively, Zelensky is now saying there's not going to be any territorial swaps before we get security guarantees, which it's already a non-starter, these security guarantees. So once again, as we've said on the show, it's clear that whether the Russians want to or not, these things are going to have to be decided on the battlefield. And we have, I've at least expanded on the fact that that principle is going to apply all the way to the Bosphorus Straits and Constantinople. And frankly, if the Russians just realized their calling, maybe they could save us all some time.
Oh, no, absolutely. And sort of just touching on that note, it's very important to keep in mind the assistance that Russia has been offering its sort of historical enemy, and I would say even orthodox civilizational enemy, Turkey, recently. We did mention a few times the building of the Akuyu nuclear power plant in Mersin, of course, where Turkey almost is 90 kilometers away from Cyprus on the southern border of Turkey and Syria. It's very key that the Russian Rosatom company is, for whatever reason, investing very heavily in Turkish energy. And on one hand, it's like, yes, maybe Russia is collaborating with a nearby ally or a nearby neighbor. But in Turkey's case, clearly Turkey as a member state of NATO, it is a hypothetical enemy. Like, very likely there will be some sort of geopolitical conflict, or at least diplomatically speaking, Turkey and Russia have been in quite a tense position, even over a country such as Syria, right, during the Syrian civil war and the Turks shooting down a Russian plane, etc. There's been lots of different conflictual tensions, I think, over the last 2 decades, to say the least. But very interesting that Rosatom is, of course, was led and it was kickstarted by a man named Sergei Vladimirovich Kirienko. We've mentioned this character a few times, but most notably, he's from Nizhny Novgorod. He was promoted to Russian politics in the 1990s by a very infamous character, Boris Nemtsov. Boris Nemtsov, if you recall, he was essentially the half Jewish, half Russian successor to Boris Yeltsin. Very sort of tall, handsome, fit, well-spoken, very, very well-spoken, charismatic politician from Nizhny Novgorod who Yeltsin promoted and essentially moved them all the way to the position of second in charge. He was almost like the prime minister, the premier of Russia in the late 1990s, alongside Anatoly Chubais, right, one of the inventors of Rosnano and all these other weird industries in the Russian Federation. But after the Russian economy crashed in the late 1990s, Boris Nemtsov lost his job, and so did Kirienko, until Kirienko somehow, this Jewish person, this Jewish administrator, slid into the Putin administration, and since then has been nesting there successfully until today. What's interesting about Kirienko is that, obviously, from the beginning, being a subsidiary and a helper of Boris Nemtsov, he was of very liberal views. In fact, being Jewish of ethnicity, he had very strange, let's just say, religious views as well. Allegedly, he was a Scientologist, a follower of various cults. He was, in Nizhny Novgorod, for example, he was friends of a lot of this weird, futuristic, quasi-Scientology sect that would predict the future based on mathematical formulas, very Pythagorean, very much into all kinds of esoteric sciences, perhaps somewhat Talmudic of him. But he was the man in charge of Rosatom. And why this is important is because Putin traveled to Sarov, actually, outside of Nizhny Novgorod, and this is exactly the same place where Saint Seraphim of Sarov spent the majority of his life, where he essentially attained, theosis to some degree, became a saint, and of course battled demons in the sort of woodlands of Sarov outside of Nizhny Novgorod. So this is a really holy zone, but unfortunately during the Soviet years, as we know, Conrad, Sarov was turned into this Area 51 by the Soviets, turned into this nuclear experimentation zone. And today, Rosatom's one of its main headquarters is located in Sarov, where Putin gave this speech celebrating 80 years of the Russian atomic industry. So if you think about it, it's 80 years since the end of the Second World War, 80 years since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and essentially 80 years since the USSR commenced with, I guess, pushing its nuclear industry to the potential that it's at today. So of course, it's a monumentous achievement by the Russian people developing nuclear technology, but it's very key to sort of understand who was sort of behind this, especially in recent years. And I think for some unfortunate reason, as I said, Rosatom's, I don't want to blame the corporation too much because it is publicly owned, but Kirienko being behind it, I wonder if this has anything to do with the building of the nuclear facility in Turkey. Russia essentially building a huge asset for its future enemy, right? Essentially, civilizationally, almost prophetically powering the enemy that it will fight in the near future. And the fact that Kirienko, this Scientology prophetic, mathematically estranged Jew is leading this entire project. And Putin praised Kirienko openly at the Rosatom 80-year anniversary in Sarov in his speech. And it's all incredibly concerning. The fact that, of course, Saint Seraphim of Sarov's name wasn't even mentioned in any of the presentations. It was just a purely sort of physics-based science discussion. And Putin did not visit Divyeva, for example, which is located just 25 minutes drive away from the Rosatom headquarters, really. If you think about it, this could have just been a really nice pilgrimage that the president could have made, but President Putin did not take his time to, of course, conduct that pilgrimage to the holy site of Divyeva, to pray at the trench, which we spoke about, of Seraphim of Sarov. So all of this, I think, spiritually speaking, is incredibly concerning. The fact that a character like Kirienko still holds such high prominence. I mean, his official position, he is the first deputy chief of staff of the Russian Federation. So he's very up high in terms of actually running the president's administration. So we just have to keep our eye out on this particular character and his conduct. But the reason I mention all of this is because obviously the Russian nuclear industry is one of its key assets going into the near future. And when we discuss, the prospects of the Third World War and how the military is advancing on the front lines, I mean, we'll just have to keep in mind that, there have been bad people in charge of this industry in the past, at least in the last 20 years. Speaking of, front lines and advancements, Russia has been making huge gains in the Pokrovsk region. Heavy fighting, of course. Pokrovsk is slowly but surely basically block by block falling to Russians from the inside. They've cracked it open. Now it's melting. The Ukrainians are openly complaining. There's calls for Pokrovsk to be evacuated. The Azov battalion has stopped really posting videos online on Telegram as much as they have prior to this. You see pro-Ukrainian YouTubers, they're really not posting any more Pokrovsk footage, most likely because the fighting is so heavy in the city itself. And it's probably not going in the Ukrainians' favor at this point. The Russians have really advanced quite strongly. Our guess is most likely there's tens of thousands of Russian troops near or in the area. And I think most likely the battlefront is really pushing forward from the Russians' perspective. And there's clear evidence of this because just north of Pokrovsk, the next town that the Russians most likely will be taking is Konstantinovka. And Konstantinovka, the outskirts of it, has been heavily getting bombed by Russian THAAD missiles. Now, to keep in mind, we've probably heard about THAAD missiles for quite a bit, but to describe them, they're not laser-guided bombs. These are bombs which are dropped by plane, and they're guided. They glide, and they're guided by Russian satellites. There's different sizes of the bombs. So obviously, the bigger the number, the bigger the explosion in layman's terms. So THAAD 250s, THAAD 500s, THAAD 1500s, and they're dropped from roughly 40 to 70 kilometers away from the target. So the Russian planes, they drop a THAAD and they quickly turn around to not be hit by Ukrainian air defense systems. And from what height can they be dropped? Roughly 10, 12 kilometers. Now, keep in mind, this is why Trump's threat of actually sending Ukraine 17 additional Patriot systems was so potent, at least from the Russians' perspective, because Patriot missile systems can hit potential incoming missiles as well as Russian planes, enemy planes, up to a height of 23 to 24 kilometers high, right? So easily they could reach any Russian planes attempting to drop THAAD missiles on their enemies. So, of course, in Ukraine at the moment only has 6 Patriot systems. So add an additional 17 to that almost quadruples its potential. I mean, it's a huge danger to Russian planes, and we know that at least, a few tens of Russian planes at this point and helicopters have been shot down throughout the SMO. We know at least 6 have been shot down by Prigozhin during his revolt in middle of 2023. So this is a huge threat to Russian pilots. And just keeping all of this in mind, Russian bombing of Konstantinovka, it's showing that they're trying to weaken the southern defenses before most likely taking out all the villages leading up to it and probably up front attacking that particular town. Because after Konstantinovka, the clear progress will be towards Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, and there's a huge potential that the Ukrainians will not be giving these cities up without a fight. We're going to see, and hypothetically, the Russians could just continue on after they take Konstantinovka and just besiege multiple cities at the same time, which will lead to either a cascading loss for the Ukrainians or such intense battles that the Russians will be forced to make drastic moves in terms of resupplying their troops, battle rotations, who knows. If there's several sieges going on at once, like Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, Pokrovsk still hasn't fallen, it'll be the first time in this entire war that the Russians will be engaged in several sieges at the same time. It'll be completely unprecedented. So we may see massive movements of rerouting of Russian troops from the north end, from Bryansk, from Kursk, Sumskaya Oblast, and Kharkovskaya Oblast towards the east in order to support this huge onslaught that the Russians are now preparing. And just for reference sake, the Ukrainians, out of the entire Donbass, the Ukrainians only control 11%. So in total, the Russians control, if you count Donetsk and Lugansk in total, the Russians control 53,000 kilometers squared. The Ukrainians control 6,500 kilometers squared. So almost nothing. The Ukrainians only control 11%. And this is, by the way, this huge taking of land that the Russians have made possible recently has been reflected in the Ukrainian Verkhovnaya Rada. So in the Ukrainian parliament, just in the last 24 hours, literally on the 23rd of August, they passed a new law, or at least they're trying to progress it through. And in this new law, the remaining 6,500 kilometer squares of the Donetsk Oblast, which belongs to Ukraine, they want to integrate it legally into the Dnipropetrovsk and the Kharkovskaya Oblast. So in a way, the Ukrainians want to abolish their own version of the Donetsk Oblast just to, I suppose, legitimize or maybe to draw some sort of artificial ceasefire lines in the future, potentially. It's really hard to sort of say what the goal of that is. Maybe this is some sort of long-term proposal for a buffer zone, or maybe they just want to remove the name Donetsk. It's just been polluting their eyes for so long. For 11 years, they just want to completely remove that name from any of their territories. So it's quite curious, but the Russian progress has been, of course, intense. And, there's a lot of talk, Conrad, about maybe the entire war should settle down in terms of the aerial warfare is getting a bit too intense. Both sides are hitting civilian buildings, both sides are hitting civilian infrastructure, and there's a lot of concern that the drones are actually killing many unintended targets, right? There's complaints on both sides, including, of course, from President Trump himself before the meeting in Alaska. There's been his open complaints that the Russians are doing way too much of drones. But the truth is the Ukrainians have been sending more drones than the Russians actually towards every single oblast adjacent to the Ukraine. And the drones are going very fast. Some of them are even reaching the outskirts of Moscow very actively. There's not a single area in Western Russia at the moment which hasn't had internet blackouts. So the way the Russians are actually fighting these drones, and this really hasn't been reported on much in the English internet, when there's a drone alert happening in a particular oblast like Voronezh, the entire Voronezh oblast internet, the 4G, the 5G completely cuts out in order to try and shut down the GPS tracking or any sort of connections the drone has to the internet to try and completely disorientate it. This means that if somebody is at work, working on the internet, it's a complete blackout. And the Russians are doing this in multiple oblasts at once. So, of course, this is economically causing, steady but surely incremental losses for Russian businesses, because obviously if people are working from home, people working from offices, the internet just literally cuts out in the middle of the day or in the evening or in the morning, depending on if there's a Ukrainian drone somewhere in the vicinity. So clearly, as long as this drone warfare continues, it's going to eat away, not just at, of course, the Ukrainian supplies and Ukrainian manpower, but also at the Russian economy. So there's multiple concerns going on here at once. And as I mentioned before, the oil refinery issue, the petrol drought happening in Russia at the moment, the Ukrainians, they know what they're doing. And Trump, again, with the Truth Social post, he knows exactly what he's talking about when he says it's unfair when only one side can play on the offensive. I mean, he's potentially putting out a threat here. And we have to mention that, who responds to this threat, Conrad? Well, Lukashenko very recently in a press conference, and I think it took place on the 22nd of August, but it was only released in the last 24 hours. It's a proper press conference. Lukashenko sitting in front of all these journalists, Western and Russian alike, and they're asking him questions about, the Putin meeting with Trump and what Lukashenko spoke to Trump about. And then suddenly Lukashenko says, "Would you like to know some insider info?" And of course, all the journalists are really, just steadily holding onto their mics, trying to understand what he'll tell them. And Lukashenko says, "Well, I'll tell you what, someone in the Russian administration told me that he proposed a Nareshnik strike on Bankova Street. And Bankova Street is where the presidential palace of Ukraine is located. And a lot of the cabinet ministerial, this is the center of Kiev, where essentially you have the people who carry out executive decisions of the Ukrainian criminal government. They're located on the street." He says, someone in the Russian government, Lukashenko said, proposed for an Nareshnik strike on Bankova Street. And Lukashenko said, and then Putin refused. Putin said, "No, we will not be striking the center of Kiev with an Nareshnik. We will not be taking out the Ukrainian president with an Nareshnik." And Lukashenko said, Putin saved the Ukrainian executive administration from an air strike. Now, it's an interesting semi-threat. On one hand, Lukashenko appears to be saying that Russia has a potential to strike any decision-making center within Kiev, within Oreshnik, which I think we have to believe so because it's an intercontinental medium-range missile, right, from what we know. But also, the Oreshnik was only revealed to the public and revealed to us on the 21st of November last year, so less than 10 months ago at this point, which means that someone must have proposed for Putin to use an Oreshnik since November last year. Could have been in January, could have been in March of this year, could have been in December. And Putin said no. So on one hand, it's either Lukashenko, the statement has been greenlit by Putin, and Putin has said, look, Lukashenko, you have to put out this semi-threat out to the public to let them know that we are in having discussions that we may potentially use an Oreshnik on Kiev. Or two, Lukashenko is passive-aggressively sort of poking Putin, saying that, look, Putin is a bit of a weakling. He's actually the one holding Russia back from taking out the Ukrainian executive. And why all of this is important is because obviously there's a lot of talk about this war being very bloodthirsty, a lot of people dying. And, there's this hesitation. Why aren't the Russians actually striking at the brains of the operation of the Kiev regime? Why are they hesitating? And Lukashenko, maybe unofficially, is saying that it's Putin's fault, perhaps. And also the proof that the war is very bloodthirsty has come out as well this week unintentionally. On Channel 1, Russia, it's been reported that a group of Russian hackers have hacked into a Ukrainian database system, and the information they've extracted from that database has revealed that over 1,700,000 Ukrainians enlisted in the military have either been listed as deceased or have gone missing, are listed as missing in action. 1,700,000 Ukrainians since the beginning of the SMO. I mean, if this is true, and this is a Russian public channel reporting this information, now it's being spread, people are claiming that the Ukrainians have lost 1.7 million people. I mean, if this is even remotely close to the true number, these losses, of course, outscale anything I've had in my predictions or even hypothetical worst nightmares. This means that the war is far from humane. It is actually one of the greatest wars that Eastern Europe has ever seen, bigger than the First World War in terms of lives lost. Yeah, it's quite interesting in that case as to why exactly regular drafted Ukrainians are being killed, but the decision makers within Kiev itself are being kept alive, including people like Kirill Budanov, the head of the SBU, who has assassinated so many Russian generals and Russian civilians within Russia itself. And he's still walking around Kiev and giving interviews and things like this. I mean, these are really important questions to raise. But generally speaking, what does that say for Russia's losses? If Russia has lost 100,000 troops over the last 3 years, that's 1/17 of the total losses of Ukraine. That's a huge ratio difference. I mean, these numbers are really, they're quite fresh. Only less than 7 days they've been released to us in the public. So I guess at the moment we can still sort of work with them. But yeah, there's been a lot of tension, Conrad, on the front lines. I think if not for the Russian progress, we can clearly say that Russia's on the back foot, somewhat afraid of Trump's negotiations. But we can clearly say that with these veiled threats from Lukashenko about the Oreshnik, with the clear progression towards Konstantinovka, Pokrovska's, of course, falling sooner or later, maybe even after the release of this episode, it'll fall any week now. Russia's very much in the driver's seat at the moment, and this really hasn't changed this week.
Yes, and when you really think about, the casualty ratios and everything, as much as people want to say, oh, Russia's failed to achieve its goals, Russia's failed to, actually, take as much territory as it wants, as efficiently as it wants, the ratio of the casualties shows that, despite most people usually needing an overwhelmingly larger force to offensively take defensive positions, the Russians still have not done a full mobilization and have managed to advance against a beyond fully mobilized Ukraine. And as the offensive party, ostensibly, it is not saying that it's a war of aggression, but just literally they are advancing and the other side is defending, as has been for most of the war. It's clear that the Russian strategy and the Russian capability is still greater, even with the full backing of NATO and the West. And again, at this point, the only way to escalate would be for actual NATO troops to be on the ground and for air dominance to truly be established by NATO pilots and whatnot. So anything short of that, the Russians are, again, people say like Russia wasn't capable of doing it. Well, Russia is proving that they are capable of standing up against, a large plurality or percentage of what NATO would throw at them in a full-scale war. So I think that's really important to realize. But people also may be wondering what specifically, whether it's something on the front lines, is causing the rapid Trump escalation. Maybe it has something to do with him feeling like the Alaska summit was useless and that Putin got one over on him. But I think a big part of it has to do with India and China completely balking at the U.S. secondary sanctions and tariffs, trying to punish them for buying Russia's crude oil through their shadow fleet. How am I got to say this guy's name right, man? Subramanyam Jaishankar, who is the external affairs minister of India. He recently met with Lavrov, and they've been rapidly broadening and expanding their trade ties. And this comes at the same time where Modi and Subramanyam also met with, Wang Yi, whoever the Chinese foreign minister is. So China and India normalizing relations, despite, historically sort of being pitched against each other by the U.S. and the West. So the U.S., in its attempt to punish these powers that have been holding up Russia's economy, keeping their energy market afloat, inadvertently pushed them together because they both refused to concede to what the U.S. wanted them to do. And now they are coming closer together, realizing that if they're not going to be able to act, freely with the United States, it's time to, come together closely here. And, this is a real BRICS moment, as it were. But I think this announcement with India, it says that they're going to be increasing annual trade between Russia and India by $100 billion over the next 5 years, which is an increase of 50%. This would make Russia India's fourth largest trade partner, while India holds the position of Russia's second largest trade partner. So very big economic developments here. Obviously, Trump's attempt at putting a 25% tariff on Indian goods, literally tying that tariff directly to these purchases that help Vladimir Putin's quote unquote war machine. This is a very big deal. And I think Trump realizing that these other economies are willing to accept these huge economic punishments from, the world's policeman, the United States, show that, he's a little bit spooked and maybe they need to, he's like, maybe we do need to take out Russia. Maybe Russia is a threat to our unipolar world order, because we know Trump himself is no fan of BRICS. So I think that's an important economic development that people need to look into. I mean, Subramanyam Jaishankar himself has always been very aware of the whole multipolarity question. I mean, I remember when he was getting pressed at one of these world forums about why India is still supporting Russia, and he had to explain that India is like a civilization state, and our concerns about both geostrategic world security and historic ties with Russia. We were not party necessarily to the Cold War in the same way you were, all these sorts of things. So he sort of had to explain this, and the journalist had really no idea. If only all Indians were as eloquent and respectable as Subramanyam. But, Russia pursuing this ally with India, you might think this might push them closer to Israel, because we know India for some reason loves Israel due to their sort of civilizational anti-Muslim conflict. But if they gain India as a true closer ally, thankfully it might come amidst them shedding a true parasite, Azerbaijan, which I think we're going to have a bit of a discussion here in a second. But the biggest evidence for this, of course, this is from Reuters, Russia striking Azerbaijan's SOCAR oil facilities in Ukraine on purpose, Kiev says. Russian drones on Monday intentionally attacked an oil depot belonging to Azerbaijani state oil company SOCAR in Ukraine's southern Odessa region for the second time in 2 weeks, Ukrainian officials said. President Volodymyr Zelensky, writing on X, said the deliberate Russian strike was an attack not only on us, but on our relations and energy security. Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha called for an appropriate diplomatic and legal response by Baku to what he described as moves against Azerbaijan's interests. There was no immediate comment from SOCAR, which operates around 60 fuel stations across Ukraine, or Azeri officials. Russia has not publicly commented on the matter. Ukraine's energy minister told reporters in Kiev it was hard to assess the damage and said rescue crews were still at work. Monday's attack follows an August 8th Russian drone attack that damaged a SOCAR oil depot. 2 industry sources told Reuters at least 4 people have been injured in that strike, they said. Russian forces have frequently targeted Ukrainian infrastructure, yada, yada, yada. And this is big news because, of course, this comes amidst other crackdowns on Azeri lobbyists, Azeri officials. Azeri relations are continuing to crumble despite the fact of this recent meeting of the Intergovernmental Commission between Russia and Azerbaijan. Lavrov participated in the 23rd meeting, which apparently took place in Astrakhan in Azerbaijan. And the foreign ministry of Russia did say the heads of the department highly appreciated the results of the Intergovernmental Commission meeting. The ministers also discussed current issues of the bilateral and multilateral agenda, various aspects of political, economic, and humanitarian cooperation, as well as regional and international security. So I've always suspected Lavrov as sort of a Turkic character. I mean, he is himself Armenian. Obviously, I would assume initially that would lead to him to have some loyalty to Armenia, for example, in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and whatnot. But no, he seems to be fully in the camp of Azerbaijan and Turkey. I've always maintained Lavrov is more of one of these Eurasianists. He's the one who is, empowering and giving clout to people like Jackson Hinkle. So unfortunately, I fear Lavrov himself may be a bit of an obstacle to Russian foreign policy, understanding the prophecies and how no, we are ultimately going to have to turn both on Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Israel. But again, what really is going on, I think this intergovernmental meeting, whatever, was something scheduled and had to go ahead as planned. But there's a good Russians with attitude thread here recently about the general state of Russo-Azeri relations. And it says here, Sergei Markov, a Kremlin loyalist, a United Russia member, and regular Russian TV talking head, was just labeled a foreign agent. Here he is in Baku calling Aliyev a brilliant leader who won the war. Might seem small, but I think this is a giant shift in Russian politics. And we have been discussing the gradual shift in Russia away from Azerbaijan. We, of course, talked about the shift towards Azerbaijan. Dmitry, I think, even before most of the RWA guys or anyone else, we highlighted the power of the Azerbaijan, the Azeri lobby in Moscow, in Russia. And the thread goes on to say, Russia is crawling with Azeri political lobbyists. We've talked about this on our podcast many times. Aliyev's little helpers had access everywhere for years. Markov was one of the most obvious offenders, parroting Baku's line while presenting himself as a Putin loyalist at home. At the height of recent Russia-Azerbaijan tensions, Azeri police arrested and tortured random Russian IT guys and journalists taken from the street. And while that was happening, Markov was in Baku groveling at Aliyev's feet, praising him as a victorious genius. Imagine a U.S. government-linked pundit in 1979 flying to Tehran to flatter Khomeini while Americans were still hostages. That's the level of absurdity Russian politics ran on, whoring yourself out for whoever paid while pretending to be loyal. Markov even freelanced to Bloomberg about Russia being ready for air ceasefire, quoted in the U.S. as a trusted Kremlin source. Nobody cared because that was normal. The entire system was performative loyalty on the surface, side gigs for foreign clients underneath. Not anymore. Being labeled a foreign agent isn't exactly Stalin's enemy of the people, but it guts your finances, your reach, and your status. And this is someone close to Peskov and Kirienko. He used to be untouchable. The message is quite clear. The Kremlin is cleaning house. The Azeri lobby is being burned out. Does that mean a real break with Baku and by extension Ankara and another Azeri ally, Tel Aviv? I think so. The strikes on Ukrainian refineries with Azeri oil weren't random at all. And also important, there's no longer a protected political class in Russia. Even the loudest Putinist can get screwed if he doesn't understand that the times have changed. Fake loyalists aren't safe anymore, and the Azerbaijan lobby is, hopefully, being taken out for good. Provided that he takes in foreign state money, that is, which obviously was the case with poor little Markov. So this is a big development. Obviously, I think the level of influence Azerbaijan had over Russia was pretty unparalleled. The fact that they got double victories in the past two Nagorno-Karabakh wars, got Russia to withdraw largely from Armenia, and then Azerbaijan completely turns on them, sides with Armenia and the U.S. to sign the Zangezur corridor deal. They just totally got screwed. And if the Russians don't realize this and frankly start not only purging Azeri influence from their politics, but also, I think, trying to reestablish Russian influence in Armenia, overthrow the current Pashinyan government, reestablish yourself there, and start to drive back out Azeri, Turkish, and now U.S. influence. I think that's one of the most important developments here. But in the midst of all of this, I think with Azerbaijan realizing that their foray and their sort of haven in Russia, the Kremlin, is over. This is from MSN. Azerbaijan wants deeper U.S. ties after Armenia peace deal. So Azerbaijan is seeking closer national security and technology ties to the United States on the heels of a peace declaration. This is the Zangezur corridor deal. During the interview in an Azerbaijan embassy, Azeri ambassador to the U.S., who has a fantastic name, Khazar Ibrahim, he told Axios his government will now work on setting up working groups and developing relations in every direction: economy, energy, defense, political, education, you name it, technology, AI. Let's open a new page, Ibrahim said. Let's work together. And not only Armenia, Azerbaijan, but let's also have Azerbaijan-U.S. relations develop. So obviously, Azerbaijan is pivoting to the West. I'm sure Israel is pleased with this in some capacity. We know Turkey and Azerbaijan are also trying to influence the Muslim Central Asian states to be much kinder to Israel. In many ways, they're not super unkind to Israel. They already send Sunni Wahhabi troops to help overthrow the Assad regime, to keep Syria and these other countries, perpetually destabilized on Israel's borders. So it may not take too much convincing, but we know, for example, Tajik terrorists and others are a constant scourge to Russia. So perhaps the Azeris will be getting involved in that field as well. But the infrastructure developments in the Zangezur corridor, Turkey is wasting no time. This is from AA, which is a Turkish news source. Turkey begins laying down groundwork for Zangezur corridor. The 244-kilometer Kars-İğdir-Aralık-Deliçi railway line in southeastern Turkey is to be the first step in realizing the Zangezur corridor. Turkey has begun laying the groundwork for that longly named railway line in the country's southeast, which will connect the country to the Zangezur corridor, ushering a new era of peace and prosperity. Yeah, this is some Turkish propaganda right here. Turkish Transport Minister Abdülkadir Uraloglu said at the groundbreaking Friday that Turkey, as a bridge connecting Asia and Europe, plays a key role in the middle corridor through mega projects like the Baku-Tbilisi-Kars railway line, the Eurasia Tunnel, the Yavuz Sultan Selim Bridge, and other bridge projects. We're beginning the construction of a line connecting Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, which will then strengthen the socioeconomic ties between Asia and Europe, he said. He highlighted that railways have been a state policy for Turkey under President Erdogan's leadership since 2002, as the country has connected railways to ports, industrial zones, and logistics centers to contribute to the network. We're also continuing the modernization efforts for our existing lines. Around 70 to 80% of them are electrified. They're talking all about their infrastructure developments. Uraloglu hailed the new railway line in the southeast as an international peace and prosperity roadmap, as the Zangezur corridor will boost the economic cooperation between Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, while reinforcing peace efforts. Notice no mention of Russia. It will usher in a golden age for global trade, especially for countries involved in the middle corridor. Yeah, the Turks love talking about this middle corridor, this, central part of Eurasia that they see themselves and their Turkic ethnos as dominating. It goes on to say the 244-kilometer-long railway line will be double-tracked, electrified, and signalized, and it will feature a transport capacity of 5.5 million passengers and 15 million tons of cargo per year, he said. The engineering marvel of a railway line will also feature 5 tunnels, 19 cut-and-cover tunnels, 3 viaducts, 10 bridges, 144 underpasses, 27 overpasses, and 480 culverts. The Zangezur corridor will make the international trade route from China to the UK more efficient, he mentioned. Meanwhile, the railway line will also contribute to Turkey's eastern and southeastern regional infrastructure production and exports, as well as the tourism in the Mediterranean region. The southeastern province of Kars will be a steel gateway of this route, while the city of İğdir's agricultural and industrial potential will be opened to the global markets with this project. Uraloglu said the project received 2.4 billion euros in external funding and will be completed within 4 to 5 years. So the Turks are not hesitating to take advantage of the U.S. provided opportunity to build across Armenia, fully connect themselves to Azerbaijan, fully connect themselves then to the rest of Eurasia, fully ending, the Christian barrier that Armenia was acting as this sort of separation with this united front that now Russia is going to have to deal with to their south, which I think is something that maybe they're realizing it now, but unfortunately it might be too little too late, as Turkey, NATO member, again, one government overthrow away from being a full NATOist power ally of Israel with, of course, their already Israeli butt buddy Azerbaijan. This is a disaster for Russia. And it, of course, as I said before, it is exactly the situation that is going to necessitate Russia to take the actions that the prophecies described. As St. Paisios says, not because they want to, but because their hand will be forced. And next thing you know, they'll be marching through Georgia, down into Turkey, into Syria, as St. Philomenos and St. Gabriel Ergabadzi said, and they'll be at Mount Tabor, and the events that we talk about will be clear for all to see.
No, absolutely. And look at the hypocrisy of Zelensky, for example. Like when Russia struck those Sokar terminals in Odessa, right, essentially damaging Azeri oil shipments through Odessa, through the Black Sea into Ukraine. Of course, Zelensky blamed Russia straight away. He just got on the mic and he instantly said, Russia's trying to disrupt Caucasian oil shipments to all of Europe, right? At the same time, just this week, Ukraine struck the Druzhba oil pipeline. This is an old Soviet pipeline, of course, leading and bringing oil to Hungary and Slovakia. And you had, of course, both Prime Minister Fico of Slovakia complaining and Prime Minister Orban of Hungary complaining to Trump. And Trump even said, I'm pretty angry about this because oil to Hungary and Slovakia was halted for 5 days because of the damage done by these Ukrainian drones to the oil shipment. And Zelensky was meek and quiet. So notice there's always double standards. Very easy to sort of kind of see this in action. Literally in the same week, you have 2 attacks on 2 different oil sites, right? One from either side, and we can see the reactions kind of live, right? It's very interesting that this week as well, as speaking about the Southern Caucasus, very sort of key area, Zangezur corridor. As Conrad, you said, the interests of Iran, of course, are central here. And we did actually see President Pezeshkian visit Armenia and speak to the arch traitor himself, Nikol Pashinyan. And first and foremost, of course, he's a traitor to the Armenian people and their interests. But Pezeshkian said something very key to Pashinyan. And of course, it was all smiles and everyone was, very cheerful. But I think Pezeshkian knows the kind of person Nikol Pashinyan is. He's a political manipulator. He's a pragmatist. He's a sellout. He's a very political animal. He's like a mini Netanyahu. And Pezeshkian says, governance in the Caucasus region must remain Caucasian. Outsourcing the resolution of Caucasus issues to extra-regional forces will complicate it. Iran's position has always been to reject any changes to international borders in the Caucasus region. So, of course, Pezeshkian is basically alluding to the fact that, look, Pashinyan, you shouldn't be too friendly with Trump. We're going to oppose it openly, and there shouldn't be any division between Iran and Armenia. Mind you, in ancient days, Armenia and Iran were always correlated. In some ways, Armenians are an ancient, I would say, branch maybe of the broader Iranian, Persian, sort of Aryan Semitic family, I would say, in that particular region. And they even belong to the same religion, Zoroastrianism, before, of course, Armenia converted to Christianity around the same time St. Constantine did in the early 4th century AD. So it's very interesting that Pezeshkian is just trying to hammer down this point that, look, we can all agree here that, and Pashinyan even said that, look, Armenia is going to control the Zangezur corridor still. Regardless of all these agreements, we're going to remain friendly towards Iran. So you can see he's trying to balance these different acts. But at the same time, what's happening on the ground in Armenia, very interesting. And this is only really fresh news. So frankly, it hasn't developed much further. But apparently there's been Armenian protests on the ground outside of the Russian military base. We mentioned this last week that Russia still retains one final military base in the Southern Caucasus, the Gyumri 105th military outpost. It has somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 Russian troops. It has tanks, all kinds of missile launchers. Locally speaking, I mean, maybe even has anti-air defense systems installed. It's a proper military outpost, quite large in terms of size. And the nearby Armenian airports, actually, they do house Russian helicopters and warplanes as well, Mikoyan, perhaps Sukhoi warplanes. So really, it's well equipped to sort of handle any sort of external threat, potentially hold back an entire Azeri army for a given time until reinforcements arrive, if you really think about it. It's a key defense, I would say, defense outpost for even Armenian interests. But you have these Armenian liberals protesting outside of the Russian Gyumri base suddenly, and they're all protesting, they're saying, Russia, go away, Russia, go away. How bizarre. They're not protesting outside of the border of Nagorno-Karabakh, for example, advocating for the 150,000 or so Armenians who were just literally, in a Gaza-type fashion, expelled from their own homes. They're not protesting at our Azeri checkpoints. They're protesting outside of a Russian base, which has barely been involved in the entire conflict. So clearly, just like many of these other protests in these various countries, this is an artificial anti-Russian ruse potentially pushed by the Pashinyan government. Again, he's choosing the wrong allies at like such a key period in Armenian history, really. And Armenia has had quite a tumultuous history. Most of the time it's been, of course, occupied by one or another powerful neighbor. So it's very interesting that at this point in time, when it's still retaining somewhat a semblance of independence, you have these horrible decision makers following the Violet Revolution making these insane decisions. And it's really interesting that the Azeri-Armenian conflict, even during the Astrakhan, the positive points that the Russian speakers made towards Azerbaijan on their official website, on the official website of the Russian Federation, it just says Azerbaijan is one of Russia's key trading partners. And they're saying this whilst there are literal Russian hostages being held in Azeri prison cells without trial. They're simply investigating them for essentially fraudulent, drug-related Iranian trafficking charges, which, mind you, these Russians can't even speak Farsi or Azeri or any language in the region. So they're clearly not drug dealers. They're just IT guys and journalists, as Russians of Attitude correctly reported. So very controversial. We're not too sure exactly what the Russian Azeri angle is, like who in the Russian Federation's executive administration is trying to target Azeri, these pro-Azeri factions within Russia itself. And why aren't they targeting the Mountain Jew oligarchs who control most of these key Russian cities, including something like 30% of the real estate market in Moscow, if not more? Some people say the majority, over 51% of the real estate market in Moscow is owned by Mountain Jews from Azerbaijan. Like, they're not hitting these people, they're hitting these weird characters like Mikhail Solomonovich Guzman, the CEO of TASS. And I think, why was Solomonovich Guzman, this Mountain Jew from Baku, even in charge of TASS in the first place, censoring the interview of Metropolitan Neophytos? I mean, we spoke about this weeks ago, but it still baffles me that somebody like this would be even placed in charge of one of the biggest news agencies belonging to the Russian state. I mean, this is clearly a conflict of interest, a man with not two, but potentially three loyalties, right? And it's just very controversial. But in any case, Sergei Markov, I'm not a big fan of him. He's, of course, a sycophant, a stooge, potentially, if not Jewish by blood, Jewish by behavior. And I'm glad that he's been labeled an agent, sort of a foreign agent. If anything, he's been sabotaging Russian politics and Russian conservatism for many decades now, putting out false statements. So I'm quite glad that he finally has marked himself by praising Aliyev for some stupid reason. Most likely, I agree, he was paid by some Azeri or Mountain Jew oligarch, and he simply made the wrong statement at the wrong time. And somebody in the Putin's administration got really upset at him. So now he's an international agent. But speaking of, people paying each other off and strange visits to various nations, a very interesting military plane left Moscow and landed in Tel Aviv Ben Gurion Airport. It was a Russian military Ministry of Defense executive plane. So these planes typically carry officials from the Russian Ministry of Defense into various locations. It's, of course, a huge, it doesn't look like a typical commercial airliner. It's something between a jet and a commercial airliner. It landed in Ben Gurion Airport. We don't know who it carried, but certainly probably top, maybe deputy defense ministers. They traveled to Israel for whatever reason. And of course, most likely not to meet with Hamas, right, Conrad? I mean, probably to speak to either leading people of the IDF, Likud members, maybe Netanyahu himself. Was Andrei Removich Belousov on board? Was it one of his deputy defense ministers? We don't know exactly. This meeting potentially only has taken place in the last 48 hours, and there's no stenogram or anything. It's been completely top secret at this point. But we do note that a Ministry of Defense executive plane from Russia has landed in Israel. So incredibly concerning, because we just have to keep in mind the genocide is still ongoing. There's still an active persecution of the Orthodox Christians, both like actively, being bombed in Gaza, Palestine, as well as huge threats, financial sanctions being placed on the Jerusalem Patriarchate, lots of concerns on the ground, and we don't see the Russian Federation's government really making any major international relations statements in terms of condemning the Israeli government. If anything, there's things being said are, well, Russia and Israel have a common heritage and a common past related to the Second World War and all these other things. And it's just very concerning and bizarre. I'm hoping that one of the predictions we made, Conrad, that potentially a compromise from Trump would have been, well, Russia needs to get involved with the whole Hamas-Israel hostage discussion crisis, right? Given that many of these hostages speak Russian or they have some sort of relationship to a Russian Jewry in the past. And I'm hoping this particular Ministry of Defense plane was not related to that. I'm hoping Putin does stay out of these particular discussions and does not receive any of the blame for the Israeli genocide that's currently ongoing in Gaza and Palestine. It's really a painful sort of situation. But at the same time, keeping in mind, as we look on the ground what's happening, it does appear that most of the pressure onto Israel is actually coming from these Western nations. For example, Australia recently has recognized Palestine. You have all these Western European countries, despite the fact that Hamas is still an active actor in the Gaza Strip. They're all essentially speaking up, stating that they're going to recognize Palestine sooner or later, even if it's with Fatah or, the Palestinian Authority. They're going to recognize some other party, but not Hamas. And still, I think it's better that they at least speak about Palestine as a sovereign entity, because it's still, miles ahead of where, for example, the Kurds are. When Kurdish sovereignty and Kurdish nationhood is not even discussed as, or maybe the Tuaregs, for example, in the Sahel, these particular entities are not discussed as people who hold any potential for nation states. But the Palestinians surely are an actual composite nation who deserve to have some sort of representation, or at least have their own borders, have their own law enforcement, their own constitution, and their own regulations, of course, so they can build and develop their culture further. And politically speaking, this is, of course, exactly what's needed. And maybe even, if you think about it positively, I think some of these European nations are just trying to take the flag of Palestinian resistance away from the radical Islamist faction of Hamas. I think they're trying to sort of politically disarm them. But clearly that's not working. And the reason why is because every single day, between 50 and 100 Palestinians are being killed by IDF bombs in Gaza City and all over the Strip. And it's getting really bad. And not just from the bombs themselves. Of course, now we have footage of children starving, or children being born with deformities and all kinds of other diseases because of the malnutrition, the constant dust that's in the air, not just from the bombs, but from the destroyed buildings. Who knows? I'm not sure if asbestos was ever used in constructing any of the apartments or buildings in Gaza, but as you can imagine, simply breathing in all this dust, it's like 1,000 outcomes of 9/11 basically taking place. We know how many thousands of Americans got sick from those two towers collapsing in the first place, right? So just imagine all of that in Gaza. There's a lot of footage of very sick, elderly folks, young people. And as the casualties build up, so does the trauma, the PTSD, the ability of the Palestinian people to forgive the Israelis. That possibility goes down drastically and radically. And I think to date, most likely Hamas has not reduced in terms of its actual numbers. If anything, it's probably strengthened. And yes, the only reason we're not seeing much fighting is because the IDF, it's bombing Hamas from a distance. And Hamas does not have any anti-air missiles to shoot down Israeli planes. But if Israel does, as the defense minister recently stated openly, Conrad, he said, look, we're going to begin Operation Gideon's Chariot B. So essentially Gideon's Chariot 2, which would mean an assault on the ground into Gaza City to apparently rescue the hostages. But as a Russian analyst recently stated, and mind you, he's essentially like a pro-Western Russian analyst, he said very clearly during an interview recently that I think the Israelis understand they don't really care about these hostages. There's little to no chance that these remaining 20 or 30 hostages being held by Hamas will be rescued. They've remained on the ground for a long time. They're incredibly, probably weakened, as you can imagine, not receiving sunlight for so long. They're most of it, we don't even know if they're alive. And frankly, the Israelis are using the hostages as simply scapegoats and pawns, as reasons for them to exterminate as many Palestinians as possible. So when the Israelis do enter into Gaza City and they do begin fighting Hamas face to face once again in a hot sort of frontal conflict, most likely their goals will not be to enter the tunnels and to retrieve the hostages. I think the hostages will probably die as collateral from the incoming clashes that will commence any day now that the Ministry of Defense and Likud Party has united. So there's really bad things happening in Gaza right now in terms of, there's no real push for peace. All this talk about ceasefires early on in 2025, they've fallen on deaf ears since the inauguration of President Trump. If anything, the conflict has escalated. The humanitarian crisis has only gotten worse. And so I think to say that Trump has brought peace to Palestine or the Holy Land, I think would be erroneous to say the very least.
Now, the genocide is reaching just absurd levels, especially, again, we were talking about this off screen, this idea that the hostages ever mattered to these Jews is just crazy to me, because they had all the opportunities to get all of them free at any moment without even necessarily making a deal, just a ceasefire. And they just never, ever took that opportunity because they knew that if they didn't have the hostages, they'd lose a major humanitarian, propaganda point. And at the end of the day, they never wanted to legitimize Hamas anyway. They wanted the whole thing to just be a sort of scorched earth genocide. And this is from Israeli 24 News. 60,000 reservists have been called up amid Operation Gideon's Chariots B, which is, the second stage of the true takeover of the Gaza Strip. It says the IDF has released its plans for the full Gaza City takeover operation, coined Operation Gideon's Chariot B, as the second part of the Gideon's Chariots offensive in May of 2025, which aimed to destroy Hamas's military capabilities and take control of 75% of the Gaza Strip. In order to complete the operation, it will be calling up 3 reserve brigades and additional battalions, 5 divisions in total. The divisions designated to be involved in the operation include the Divisions 36, 162, 98, 99, and the Gaza Division. Some reserve battalions will be called for periods of service extended to 40 to 60 days. The entire operation will involve the 5 IDF divisions, 12 brigade level teams, and the 2 brigades of the Gaza division, southern and northern, the forces of the Nahal brigade combat team. It goes on to talk about what's going on in Gaza City and Jabalia. The plan will advance in phases, starting with preparations that have already begun Tuesday night, with Givati entering and operating in the village of Jabalia, north of Gaza City, and the Nahal Brigade in Zaytun, south of the city. The IDF has said it will also begin to warn the population in advance to allow time for citizens to evacuate. So I've always wondered, are they going to force the Christians in the Christian quarter of Gaza City, where St. Porphyrios Church, where Most Holy Family Catholic Church, and where the Baptist Hospital is? I'm wondering if these places are also going to be forced out of their homes, because this is the current situation. Obviously, again, it was probably propaganda that they were considering, this is why he has the hardliners in his cabinet. He had the hardliners, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, saying, we will only accept the full annexation plan. And then Netanyahu gets to be the centrist, coming out and saying, no, I only approved, Operation Gideon's Chariot B, which is only allowing us to annex a little bit over 50% of the Gaza Strip. And it's just like, oh, wow, aren't you a humanitarian, as you lead to the 83% civilian casualty rate that we currently see in Gaza, probably the highest civilian casualty rate of any war where we've had any kind of reliable statistics on this whatsoever. Yet we want to learn that World War II was just a genocide with a war going on, and they wanted us to consider this a war. No, this is a genocide pretending to be a war. And World War II was a civilizational conflict where world Jewry declared war on Germany and its allies, and then they made up a bunch of atrocity propaganda afterwards to, frankly, justify what we're seeing right now in Gaza. It was all a multi-generational plan. But no, that casualty rate is just disgusting. And the fact that we are, again, funding this, that Trump has approved this Gideon's Chariot operation, that Trump is approving, what Smotrich is planning on doing with the E1 West Bank annexation plan that Mike Huckabee, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, on Thursday completely approves. He says that the Israeli-occupied West Bank settlements are not illegal under international law. He told Al Arabiya it is not a violation of international law for Israelis to live in Judea and Samaria, as usual using the Ziokan biblical name for the West Bank. Obviously, it goes into the Geneva Convention and all these sorts of things, but in 2008, Huckabee, it's known that he said there's no such thing as a Palestinian. And in response to these countries about to recognize Palestine, for example, and in relation to Israel's recent approval of the E1 settlements, he said, I don't know what the Europeans thought they're going to accomplish, but through their actions, they're accomplishing something they didn't want to, essentially give a green light to the Israelis to take more pieces of Judea and Samaria, either by sovereignty or annexation. Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, a settler himself, has said that the E1 expansion will erase the idea of a Palestinian state. In an earlier interview, Huckabee said the U.S. wouldn't oppose the expansion. Whether or not there should be massive development in E1 is a decision for the government of Israel to make, he said. We should not try to evaluate the good and the bad of that, but simply just say that, as a general rule, it is not a violation of international law. It's also, I think, incumbent on all of us to recognize that Israelis have a right to live in Israel. That coming right after there's no such thing as a Palestinian is pretty wild, just if I do say so myself. But the fact that this is going to completely cut off East Jerusalem from any other Palestinian part of the West Bank. This is going to be a huge blow to, like you said, they're literally doing this to prevent the realization of this big European, Canadian, these other countries that are pushing to recognize Palestine, to its 1967 borders. Apparently Saudi Arabia is really pushing this. So I'm assuming that what's going on here in the West Bank is alienating Saudi Arabia and making, the fulfillment of the Abraham Accords more and more difficult. You would at least hope so, right? But we do have to talk a little bit about Lebanon. They are disarming the Palestinian refugee camps there. And just recently, Al-Hadath, a Hezbollah, related news source in Lebanon, they informed the president, the prime minister, and the commander of the Lebanese army that any formal state-imposed weapons restrictions or practical steps to start the disarmament of Hezbollah would inevitably lead to confrontation, which this is, again, we've talked about the looming threat of Lebanese civil war as Tom Barak, the U.S. envoy to Turkey, and then ostensibly the czar of Lebanon that the U.S. has appointed, he's demanding the disarmament of Hezbollah. The Maronite, largely dominated government is pushing it as well, completely ignoring the Israeli threat. And it appears that Hezbollah may have to take up arms against its own people again to even continue the opportunity to take up arms against Israel. So if you have any thoughts on the West Bank and Lebanon before we talk about Syria, Dimitri, I would love to hear it.
No, I think the increased pressure on the West Bank will only continue, I think, in light of the genocide of Gaza. I think at the same time, while the conflict in the Middle East rages, especially in the Levant, in that region, Israel is not going to lose the opportunity to expand further settlements. In fact, this is funny enough, the settlers actually, they call themselves, I think, the people of Bashan or something. There's new settlers actually planning settlements further into Syrian territory as well, like over the Golan Heights. So in areas which were literally, they belonged to President Assad and the Syrian people not even a year ago, right? In like November of last year, there was, Syrian forces and Russian checkpoints stationed there. And now you have Jewish settlers planting these flags, putting tents up and literally preparing to build these bizarre like Zionist-style farms and kibbutzes on Syrian territory over the Golan Heights. I mean, I don't know, these people don't even feel a sense of safety for themselves. I mean, they have assault rifles and things, but do they realize there's jihadis, there's Druze, there's a bunch of local factions there who potentially won't be happy to see them? I mean, just the level of fervor that the weird Talmudic nationalism that's being expressed by these Zionists in some of these areas, not just the West Bank, but also like over the Golan Heights. It's really something else. It's like they're being moved by this idea of pushing out greater Israel. So these are clearly like the pawns, the peons and the grunts of the, we should just say the Talmudic Israeli order that's being constructed at the moment, that's really in charge of a lot of the bloodshed that we see currently in the Middle East. And like clearly we know that because Israel was a key actor in the fall of the Assad regime in the Syrian civil war. We know that Israel actively supported ISIS. Mossad most likely openly collaborated, as well as we know the CIA collaborated with constructing ISIS in the first place. There's all kinds of strange theories, and Operation Timber Sycamore just being one example, of course, from American history from the Obama years in Iraq and Syria. But if we look much closer at Syria at the moment, it's really a powder keg ready to explode in terms of just the number of armed factions who are not willing to give up power. And the Syrian government itself, despite it sort of signing weird agreements with Israel, not realizing that it's actually the Syrian factions within itself that are not willing to settle on a jihadi rule. And I would have to just point out the differences between, say, the SNA, or at least the Syrian army at the moment as it stands, so, under the leadership of HDS and most likely Turkish military experts, and the SDF, which is largely Kurdish. There's Yazidis, there's Kurdish, not just secular sort of Sunni Muslims, but they're certainly not Wahhabis and certainly not Salafis. The Kurdish Islam, I would say, yeah, it is Muslim and Sunni in its majority. However, it's very different to the radical Islam being forced upon them by ISIS and HDS, which is why they were fighting ISIS in the first place. It has a lot of, let's just say, local, cultural, incremental indebtedness, I would just say, to local customs and traditions, not to call it heretical from a Muslim perspective, but the Wahhabis and Salafis certainly would view it as such. And so we just have to view the map of Syria right now with the David's Corridor as the main link, Conrad, connecting essentially these Druze factions in the southwest and just along the David Corridor to the northeast, the Yazidis, right, and the Kurds, the Sunnis, and the essentially moderate Sunni Muslims. And they're all watching what's happening in Damascus very closely. And what's happening is not something very poignant. And even the Jerusalem Post, like this is a Jewish publication, it's pointed out there's a lot of concerns from the Kurds and the Druze that the Syrian government has delayed the parliamentary vote. So obviously, Syria is trying to pretend to be a democracy, right? With a parliament in Damascus, with local elections, of course, in all these various regions. So all the different factions could bring their own representatives to Damascus to operate in a democratic type fashion, right? Like a Congress. However, Druze votes and Kurdish votes have been delayed in local elections. So there won't be any Kurdish or Druze representatives in Damascus anytime soon. Now, this is only, I think, a point to escalate matters further. We know the Kurdish forces, there's over 100,000 of them. These are troops, armed, experienced. All of them have over 10 years experience fighting ISIS. They're positioned on the Euphrates River and along the entrance of the David's Corridor, right, along the border of Syria and Iraq. They're armed to the teeth. And of course, they're highly motivated. Some portions of the Kurds, of course, of the SDF are completely ideologically opposed to the weird radical Islam being pushed from Damascus, being pushed by, of course, al-Shabani, the foreign minister, al-Shara al-Jolani. And we know that they would most likely view it as an ideological war if they would ever clash. However, we just have to keep in mind the disparity of armed forces. This could potentially, if the conflict was to prolong itself, Conrad, this could give an excuse for Turkey to again move into the northeastern regions of Syria and for Turkey to occupy even more territories. And for that, in our Syria analysis episodes with Alia and with Syrian Girl, we spoke about the potential division of Syria, like the sovereignty of Syria being completely eradicated and Syria being divided among multiple nations. And of course, one of those being Turkey, the other one, Israel, taking huge swaths of land, potentially Damascus itself. And we definitely see that potential in the near future. So what the powers in charge wish for Syria, I mean, it really depends on how these new parliamentary votes will go. Will they invite Druze representatives, Yazidis, Kurds? Will they sit them all at a table and just explain that, look, we all have similar masters? It's literally every single actor, Conrad, acting in Syria right now, except for the Russians, they all have 1 or 2 degrees separation. The Kurds have Israeli American support. The Turks support the Syrian HTS government. The Turks are, of course, members of NATO, which are allied with the US. The Turks do, I guess, ideologically and in rhetoric oppose Israel, but Israel is the US's greatest ally, and the US is, of course, the leading nation in NATO. So it doesn't really make sense why all these factions are fighting within Syria unless you just consider the fact that they view Syria as just a big cake or like a massive pizza or a meal that needs to be divided and cut up into pieces. This is a predatory operation that we're seeing from these big power players in the Middle East. The US, of course, being the overseer, sort of watching from above as Turkey and Israel fight for who gets the most. And of course, the regular Syrian people on the ground will suffer. I think the same fate will most likely befall Lebanon if Hezbollah and the regular Lebanese government do not get along. And I think the Lebanese government really understands this, that they're looking at what's happening just to their east, next door, and they see a land which is about to be engulfed in a completely fresh and maybe even a bloodier Syrian civil war with almost no foreign intervention, not from America and certainly not from Russia. Russia will most likely not be entering into Syria again with just as many troops to sort of put down jihadi violence anytime soon. So this is potentially going to spell more conflict. And we can see even if Jerusalem Post and Haaretz, for example, are predicting some sort of conflictual clashes between Druze, Kurds, and HTS regime in Damascus sometime soon, I think most likely that's what's on the cards. And we know that Israel most likely will pick up the pieces once it's all done. We're going to see more Zionist settlements in the southwest of Syria, more expansion of Greater Israel, and the land will be very clearly divided. All these powers, they're using Syria as a battleground in some capacity. If you can look at it geopolitically, the Turks will most likely, they're using Syria as a way of experimenting with their military advisors, their military technology, using the Syrian Arab Sunni radical government as a toy, as a proxy, just as in a way Russia potentially was using Donetsk and Lugansk as their proxies, you can say, in years past. And at this point, just as Russia was practicing and perfecting its military technologies in Ukraine, Turks were perfecting their military strategies and most likely tactics in Syria. And I think we're seeing this clear analogy. Both sides are carrying out special military operations, and unfortunately, it's just the regular people that suffer.
No, it's true. And I'm glad you mentioned those settlers, Dimitri, in what the Jews are calling the Alone Habashan region. It's near the Tel Hazaka region of Syria on the border with Israel. These people calling themselves the pioneers of Bashan. They crossed the fence. They are trying to set up an Israeli settlement. In this region, the Israeli forces are, of course, advancing deeper and deeper into Syria, actually taking over former Russian outposts. We've also seen the Syrian government requesting that the Russians return to some of their military outposts and bases. Ostensibly, some commentary, some members of the commentary had suggested that might have actually been to curb the Israeli advances in the south, as the Russian presence might deter them for that, as the Israelis are ostensibly afraid of alienating the Russians and driving the Russians too far into the hands of the Iranians. But you're right, Dimitri, about the perpetual failure of Syria to unite as any kind of state. Of course, this is from Ruda, citing a lot of Reuters sources as well. Syrian elections are now officially excluding the Kurdish and Druze areas. The first Syrian election since the fall of the regime will not include areas controlled by Kurdish forces in the northeast and Druze in the south due to security challenges, the spokesperson for the electoral body said on Saturday. out of the Higher Committee for People's Assembly elections commitment to fair representation in the People's Assembly for the 3 Syrian provinces, Suwayda, Hasaka, and Raqqa. Given the security challenges these governorates are witnessing, the Supreme Committee has decided to postpone the electoral process in the aforementioned provinces until suitable conditions in a safe environment for conducting them are available. This largely serves the interests of the Syrian regime, because now all of these, progressive minority regions that would vote for much more liberalizing, much less Islamist, much more largely pro-Western, pro-Israeli, pro-anything else, not pro-Turkish, pro-not Turkish, they're now not going to be represented in this election. I mean, it does provide them an opportunity to claim autonomy. This is from the Global Eye. Druze factions in Suwayda and Jabal al-Druze have announced the establishment of the National Guard Forces, a unified military body loyal to Sheikh Hikmat al-Hijri, a prominent Druze leader known for his staunch opposition to the al-Shura regime. The group, declaring itself the official military representative of the Druze community, aims to protect the Druze identity and the Jabal al-Druze region. Notably, key Druze factions like Men of Dignity and the Free Sons of the Arab Mountain were excluded due to their support for integration under Damascus rule and ongoing talks with the regime. The National Guard forces also recognize Sheikh al-Hijri as the sole spiritual authority, challenging the traditional leadership trio that includes Sheikh Hamoud al-Hanawi and Yusuf Jarbu, who favor cooperation with the al-Shura government. So, big developments in al-Suwayda in the Druze regions, but even more developments. This is from the National. Syria to send army into eastern provinces if Kurds fail to cooperate. The Syrian military is planning a major offensive by October to capture 2 main provinces on the Euphrates River from a mostly Kurdish militia that has refused to submit to Damascus, security forces told the National. If the Syrian Democratic Forces do not hand over the bulk of its territorial possessions, a Syrian attack force of 50,000 is being assembled near the desert city of Palmyra that will sweep north and capture the governorates of Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor with support from their overwhelmingly Arab tribal populations, the sources said. One of the sources, who holds a sensitive security position in Syria, said the offensive would not go ahead without an American green light. Another key would be ensuring non-intervention by Israel, which last month bombed Damascus in what it said was an effort to protect Druze amid deadly violence in the southern province of Suwayda. U.S.-sponsored talks have failed to make progress, bringing differences between the two sides. The secular SDF is increasingly being seen as recalcitrant in Washington by not handing any significant power to Damascus, the source says, a view closer to that of Turkey, which wants the SDF's demise. Reestablishing central control of SDF authority has emerged as a major obstacle in stabilization since the removal of Bashar al-Assad. Deadly clashes have increased between the SDF and forces loyal to Damascus since the U.S.-sponsored talks between the two sides faltered last month. The two sides signed a deal in March to integrate the SDF into the Syrian army, but relations have soured since then. Urged by Saudi Arabia and Turkey, the U.S. embarked in May on normalization with Damascus. President Trump met with al-Shura in Riyadh, giving a glimpse of a potential alliance that could weaken Iran and Russia and their allies in the Middle East. So, the SDF, again, we've seen the SDF mobilizing even their Armenian militias, which also have women in them, the SDF and the YPG, these Kurds and these people near Syria and Iraq. They love mobilizing women. I guess it's the only way. I guess they have to, because like this article pointed out, most of the actual people in these provinces are still Sunni Muslims that would perhaps be okay with integrating with Damascus, so they have to rely on everyone they can from these Kurdish, Armenian, these other ethnic groups. And of course, Iranian influence is one of the key things here, because this is ostensibly a clash between Turkish and U.S. influence, and Iran is sort of looking to play this, however they would. But, looking at a potential anti-SDF operation, I think would be a very big development, because that could escalate things with Turkey and Russia. There's even been talks that Russia could support the SDF. And if there's just another reason for Russia to potentially not trust Turkey, then, we know what those sorts of things lead to. But we do need to talk about Iran before we shift gears and start talking about Venezuela. And this is from France 24. European powers to resume nuclear talks with Iran as snapback sanctions loom. Ahead of the August 31st deadline imposed by France, Britain, and Germany to trigger a snapback sanctions mechanism, Iran on Friday agreed to resume nuclear talks with the E3 this week. The Israel-Iran war in June has added pressure on the European powers to reach a diplomatic solution. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and his French, British, and German counterparts agreed on Friday to resume talks next week. Araghchi spoke by phone with his French, German, and British counterparts. Jean-Noel Barrot, the French foreign minister, wrote on X, "We just had an important call involving my colleagues David Lammy, the German foreign minister, and Kaja Kallas with our Iranian counterpart regarding the nuclear program and the sanctions against Iran that we are preparing to reapply." German Foreign Minister Johann Wadfel confirmed talks next week and warned Iran that sanctions would snap back into effect unless it reached a verifiable and durable deal to diffuse concerns about its nuclear ambitions. European concerns over the Iranian program have mounted since Tehran cut off all cooperation with the IAEA after Israel's 12-day war against Iran. Iran has long insisted its program is peaceful, though it is the only non-nuclear armed nation enriching uranium to current levels. The US and the IAEA and others say Iran had a nuclear weapons program up until 2003. So we're still wading through, obviously, all of the Iranian propaganda, but some big news that sort of came as we were recording this, which I think is interesting as we discuss the Azeri situation. Of course, in the past, Belarus has had an unfortunately close relationship with Azerbaijan. Perhaps Lukashenko has learned his lesson on this, but you mentioned Dmitry Pezeshkian's visit, for example. He's visited both Armenia and he's discussed Azerbaijan recently. But here, people remember the Belarus visit. The Ukrainian Foreign Intelligence Service here claimed, this is from the War Reporter, the Ukrainian Foreign Intelligence Service claims that during Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian's recent visit to Belarus, Tehran asked Minsk for assistance in restoring its damaged air defense and electronic warfare systems following the June war with Israel. So, potential Lukashenko, Iran, Russia axis connection here. That gets the gears turning on Lukashenko releasing these opposition figures, what that really potentially means. But, it does show that Iran, Russia, Belarus still very close allies. Iran meeting with Hezbollah figures in Iran, meeting with Joseph Ayoun. Of course, they're still funding the Iraqi Popular Mobilization Forces. So the connection between Russia, the axis of resistance, this is still very much real. However, unfortunately, both due to Iran's real lack of connection with Hamas as they're a Sunni militia, and Russia has said almost nothing about Gideon's Chariot, about these E1 settlements. It doesn't seem that we're going to necessarily see any huge stand-ups to Israel anytime soon. It will be other circumstances regarding Turkey, perhaps regarding Israel's escalations against Iran, and regarding these negotiations, snapback sanctions, and Trump's calls for more U.S. strikes on Iran's nuclear enriched uranium that will ultimately lead to Russia, these other countries sort of going against a newly forming axis. Of course, the fall of Erdogan, we're going to be keeping a close eye on that as well. But before we move on to Venezuela, Dimitri, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Iran, the rest of the region, everything going on there, Turkey, their role in Syria, and of course, this recent news from Belarus regarding Pezeshkian's visit.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. It almost shows at least that Russia is using, because we know Lukashenko most likely, at least on paper, doesn't really do anything in terms of foreign policy without President Putin's approval. We know this now because there are Oreshniks stationed in Belarus. There are nuclear missile silos in Belarus itself. There's obviously still a Wagner training camp in Belarus. The integration of the Russian-Belarusian military industrial complexes are so intensely bound together that we know that Lukashenko most likely is not entirely an independent actor. So it's quite curious as to why, for example, Pezeshkian himself cannot go to somebody like Vladimir Putin openly, and he has to go to Lukashenko for assistance. And we know that Belarus itself, one of its main industries is building these various parts for the Russian war machine. Like, it does actually have major factories. It does have some certain ability to restore complex technology. So perhaps this is simply a utilitarian move by Pezeshkian, or it's an indirect way to keep Putin on some sort of sound footing with Netanyahu for whatever reason. Again, very mysterious and somewhat cringeworthy, perhaps, if President Putin is still somewhat relying on his Israeli connections for whatever reason. Again, we just have to sort of lay these big questions out. Putin is surrounded by very questionable people. Kirienko, for example, Jewish. Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin, half Armenian, half Jewish. There's a lot of these various characters who potentially have dual loyalties or even triple loyalties of various nations, and they're trying to somewhat keep Putin's relationship with Israel afloat, which would reflect President Putin's statements after the 12-day war, in which he openly said he's not supporting Iran because of the Russian 2 million speaking Israeli Russians, of course, living in the state of Israel, and they're almost Russian citizens. All of that bizarre statement, which still, I think, shocks so many of us, I think reflects the idea that Russia is very sensitive, for whatever reason, with its relationship to the Israeli state. And so Pezeshkian needs to seek assistance through some sort of, let's just say, auxiliary pathway with Lukashenko. But also we know Lukashenko's friendly relationship with Aliyev, him, of course, his relationship with Aliyev's father as well, Gaidar Aliyev, goes back to the 1990s. So Lukashenko being very experienced with local politics, maybe Pezeshkian is just trying to build that connection a bit closer. So hopefully Lukashenko manages to provide that assistance to Iran. But speaking of just Iranian security concerns, there's been very interesting events actually located in the southeast of the country. Iran claims it killed in action 6 Israeli-linked militants in the Sistan-Baluchistan province. So this is in the southeast of Iran. So a very, shall we say, tumultuous border. Potentially this is the we think about the Iranian border with Azerbaijan as being somewhat sensitive, but in fact, there's not that many clashes that take place. In fact, there are none. But the real separatist concerns for Iran, they actually come from the southeast, where Iran borders these, shall we say, ethnically diverse areas where you have Afghanis, Pashtuns, people belonging to various ethnic groups related to Pakistan. And these are areas as well that we know the US and the State Department has been actively involved in, training the Mujahideen since the 1970s and 80s. We know the and Pakistan, mind you, has been very friendly towards Iran recently and just generally has been anti-Israeli. Some are saying Pakistan isn't necessarily an enemy here, but keep in mind that I think Iran is very concerned of its security in the southeast. So there has been clashes recently. The IRGC, so the Iranian Revolutionary Corps, has stated that it's killed 6 Israeli-linked spies. We don't have any reason to not believe them, given how many actual spies, various Afghani double agents, Indians, and literal Mossad agents they've captured over the last 2 months or so since the 12-day war. I think the numbers have reached over 1,000 people at this point that have been captured within Iran. So there's huge spy networks that have been constructed by Mossad. And, it's something that can probably only be compared to the pager operation against Hezbollah. And so I think Iran is really in the state of rebuilding its defenses. And when I've spoken to many people from Iran themselves, Iranian patriots, they very much of the mind that, yes, we've made a huge mistake becoming somewhat lukewarm, a little bit too dependent on our security. We thought we had matters under control. And then these terror acts at the beginning of the 12-day war really caught us off guard. We did not expect so much internal instability. But yes, speaking of internal instability, there's also protests ongoing in Iran, major cities, Isfahan, Tehran, for example. These protesters, and if you look at them, there's a lot of women protesting as well, and they're wearing hijabs, for example. It's not like these are entirely liberal women. It's strange. They seem to be supporting either the previous regime, that is the Iranian monarchy, or they're just supporting some sort of anti-corrupt measures, very similar protests to what took place in Turkey, and again, the protests that are taking place right now in Serbia. So, and again, we know most likely these protesters are being funded, pushed from the inside. We know Iran, despite what we may disagree with the regime of the mullahs, and I think as a Russian, historically speaking, the mullahs were always a big danger to Russian Orthodoxy in general. We just have to recall the killing of the Russian ambassador Alexander Griboyedov, the genius poet in the 1820s, in the embassy in Iran, which was, of course, fomented by the mullahs. The mullahs were always anti-Russian, while the shahs in Iran were always pro-Russian. So this was the very interesting division of power in Iranian sort of spiritual symphonia-style politics. But generally speaking, the mullahs at the moment, the supreme leaders himself, the IRGC, they're very much not pro-Russian necessarily, but definitely anti-Israel. And we have to understand that these protesters, despite what kind of slogans that they're pushing, at a time where the nation's sovereignty is at risk, I think it's very clear that they're being pushed by and they're being funded by outside sources. It's very clear they're not aware that their nation will be turned into a Libya, and Iraq, Syria, if Israel and the enemies of Iran have their way. I mean, democracy is not going to come to Iran. That's the unfortunate thing. And I think when we speak about Venezuela, it's exactly the same thing. It's like no matter how much we may dislike Maduro or the supreme leader or the mullahs or the weird radical Shia Islam that has taken over control of the Persian people, it's the fact is the liberal New World Order and Zog that is coming to replace that regime will not bring about anything better. That is not the real alternative. If anything, the status quo at the moment, unfortunately, will need to be humbled with that, as opposed to whatever this globalist structure is trying to bring. And again, trying to enlighten these people with death, destruction, and again, liberalism. So these protests in Iran, I think, are entirely artificial. And yes, they literally, if you recall, there were protests during the Israeli bombardment of Iran during the 12-day war. So those protests have continued for 2 months, and yeah, the Iranian police are active on the streets, but it's just very unfortunate that the Iranian people, despite being sanctioned for 50 years, do not understand that their enemy most likely is not internal, but coming from the outside.
No, that's exactly correct. And, the Middle East, every it's just spreading all the way farther and farther into Central Asia. We have to discuss each country, surrounding Israel as greater Israel, or at least its ambitions expand. So we're obviously going to keep everyone posted on Iran, on the Zangezur corridor, and everything there. But now we have to move away from Eurasia and discuss South America and discuss the big escalations there as Trump has sent major naval forces. As of right now, it's the USS Gravely, the USS Iwo Jima, the USS Sampson, the USS San Antonio, the USS Fort Lauderdale, the USS Jason Dunham, as well as a major U.S. naval submarine currently off the coast of Venezuela. Of course, they've upped the $50 million reward on Maduro. They're saying that many Trump allies are saying that 2025 will be Maduro's final year in power. In response to this, Maduro is calling on, the Bolivarian military for people to rise up, for, the people to save the revolution, all this classic, communist rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, all of the rhetoric from the U.S. is about how Maduro is the leader of the Cartel de los Sols. They say that he has nothing to do with actually a legitimate state. It's just a narco state. Of course, Lavrov and the Russians said that they are going to be supporting and standing with Maduro against Western regime change efforts, which this is very nakedly becoming. And of course, the U.S., everyone's talking about how this is about oil and everything, when in reality, Maduro just signed a major deal with Chevron. There's no real separation between the West and Venezuela's oil here. I think this is largely about Russian and Chinese influence and these sorts of things, as well as even potentially ideological things. Who knows what other secret issues could be going on behind the scenes. The U.S. drug war, it could be that the U.S. wants to be the ones to control the drug flow through this region, the CIA, these other operators. And I'm no fan of Maduro, compared to Putin, Xi, these other people that, I have sort of a respect for. I think Maduro is sort of a goober who I think benefits more from foreign support than other more deserving leaders like Assad, who could have, I think deserved a bit more support. But ultimately, this harkens back to the Guyana Essequibo situation. We wonder if that will happen. Of course, Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, recently has been forced to sort of declare war on Colombian militias, the supposedly far-right Colombian militias on Venezuela's border that, potentially they could be used for the U.S. to escalate against Venezuela. And Petro, being a hardcore ally of Palestine and, a much more multipolar thinker, maybe he is operating in tandem with Venezuela on this front. So obviously the U.S. escalation in South America is quite dramatic. Other news, of course, in Africa, the other continent where people sometimes forget, prosecutors and courts in the Congo are now seeking the death penalty for the former president of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Joseph Kaliba. And the reason this is relevant is because he is currently in the M23 occupied territory in the Congo. I believe he has also been accused of being a traitor by supporting the M23 ambitions. Perhaps he is some kind of Rwandan agent, but I just find it very interesting that with all these ceasefires, of course, everything is still ongoing, but, he's acting as a very relevant political figure. I think he likely wants to become president again, and then the court is just like, well, we're sentencing him to death. I guess this is how things work in Africa. But the only other African news, I know there's news about the Tuareg rebels, things going on over in the Sahel region as the Russia core continues to face struggles from other formerly French colonies. The Sudan civil war is still going on in Sudan. The UAE is continuing its support for the RSF there, which is, again, still one of the bloodiest conflicts ongoing that people don't talk about as much. So, Dimitri, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Maduro, the Venezuela situation, as well as some of these African fronts before we move on to some church news. Of course, there are major Chinese drills ongoing around Taiwan. Much like Operation Gideon's Chariot A and B, we have, I believe it's Operation, Joint Sword or something like that. B, which A has already occurred. So B, this major Chinese exercise around Taiwan where they're escalating their ship and airplane presence, setting new records for violations of the ROC, as it's called, airspace. So all of your thoughts on these fronts, Dimitri, before we discuss church news, feel free to go as deep as you like.
Yeah, I think the Venezuela situation is very interesting because we see Donald J. Trump, despite the fact that he was positioning himself as like a Nobel Peace Prize, potential candidate, that he was supposed to win something for at least ending conflicts around the world. And he takes responsibility for ending the Pakistan-India 5-day war and all these other things. But the weird thing is he is mobilizing the US Navy as no other president has really in recent years. For example, the US naval ships are moving all over the map: Persian Gulf, Red Sea, Eastern Mediterranean, Pacific, right? There's all kinds of discussions regarding Taiwan and the future of Chinese influence in the South China Sea. The Philippines is constantly calling like red alert, asking the US to bring in ships into the South China Sea to give them that support in those various shoals. There's all kinds of concerns. Now, of course, the US Navy has moved towards Venezuela. Again, this could be just posturing, for example. Again, this is Alex Jones, for example, has recently spoken out that he's a big hater of communism, obviously, but he's spoken for the overthrow of the Maduro regime, and I think this is clearly coming from the position that, look, if Donald J. Trump will do something good during his administration, it is the overthrowing of this oligarchic, nepotistic tyrant in Maduro. But I think clearly it's, as you said, Conrad, correctly, Iraq wasn't about the oil, right? Iraq was about more than that. It was greater Israel. Venezuela, most likely, is again the expansion of globalist tyrannical influence further in the south. It's again destabilizing the region. And yes, long term speaking, over the next century or so, most likely it will be about securing and at least turning whatever's left of Venezuela, if a conflict does break out, into a wasteland which major corporations can suck oil from indefinitely. And of course, and they'll have security groups, like we mentioned, our recent A4 episodes, that will be more powerful than the local military. Just keep in mind, Venezuela at the moment has quite a potential. Not just the militia, of course, there's millions of people that can be apparently enlisted, men and women alike, in this proletariat-style defense system that Venezuela has set up. I'm not sure exactly, because, mind you, in communist societies, typically in Venezuela is the same, weapon access is quite limited. So exactly how trained these militiamen are, if they are called to arms, will be, again, probably not even as trained as regular Americans who have the Second Amendment. But keep in mind, the regular military is numbered at around 130,000, and there's only 5,000 or so sailors on those ships. So at the moment, we're looking at this naval flotilla that the US is using if we will see a conflict in the next few weeks. If there is some sort of escalation or some sort of black swan event, it'll be a long-range bombardment of key Venezuelan targets. But we have to keep in mind that it could be a joint operation. For example, on the ground protests in Venezuela, you could have maybe a Venezuelan presidential guard, or a Venezuelan general turning against Maduro. Because remember, $50 million American for any Venezuelan, even Maduro himself. Like, if Maduro can't turn himself in and take the reward, right? But clearly this will be more than his entire salary and technically his entire net worth, period. Like, $50 million American is more than I think most Venezuelans would have, besides probably the millionaires, or there's probably no Venezuelan billionaires at this point, but it's an insane amount of money. And so I think many were tempted by that. And we know that, unfortunately, a lot of these South American countries are incredibly corrupt, due to the just the bureaucratic nature and the fact that these nations were set up from the beginning with all these networking, nepotistic, Masonic structures. It kind of inbuilt this idea of betrayal and backstabbing. It was kind of already inherent in the cultures of the politics of these nations. And in particular, Bolivar himself, was one of these shady characters in Venezuelan history. And this is someone that Maduro, ideologically, this is like a demigod for him. Even the army is called the Bolivarian army, not necessarily the Venezuelan armed forces. So it's just all very concerning. And I'm quite glad that Lavrov at least is standing behind Maduro. And the Russian Federation hopefully is not just symbolically standing behind Venezuela, because Venezuela is not Cuba. This is not the Cuban Missile Crisis. Like, Cuba was, yes, it is literally right there in the Gulf of Mexico, right under Florida. Yes, we can kind of see that positioning missiles in Cuba is something that, obviously could warrant an American special military operation, similar to if NATO literally expanded into the Ukraine, right? Just several hundred kilometers away from Moscow. That's an actual threat. But Venezuela is far enough for Russia and China to, again, make sure the country remains somewhat sovereign. And I think it's very important that the BRICS nations, including Brazil, I think it's time for Brazil to really, and I know it's very heavily influenced by American politics, but it's time for Brazil to also step up and actually, Venezuela is not its neighbor, but it's in the same region, to try and bolster the sovereignty of its potential future ally in the region. Because Venezuela may have a future in this new BRICS economy that's being constructed. And we know how much Trump and his cabinet really hate BRICS and the potential future collaboration that that may bring to the multipolar world. So all these are very interesting concepts. And speaking of like former colonial rule and all these things in Africa and the Sahel region, it's really clear that Russia at the moment, the fact that Wagner has completely withdrawn from Mali, Russia remains stationed in Mali. Just keep in mind, Russia has official Ministry of Defense structures defending not just the Mali, but the Burkina Faso governments. There's still active fighting going on against radical Muslims, but also the Tuareg factions. There's been accusations thrown out against these Tuareg sand people. And I don't mean to say sand people in like a negative light. Like, these are Bedouins, matriarchal, very different sort of Islam to what you regularly see. Like, they, in fact, it's very June-like, sort of just like of the Kurds, different from the Salafi Wahhabism we see, but still, it seems that they're influenced by some sort of foreign intervention. The Russians have been, and the Mali and Mauritanian officials have been openly accusing the Tuaregs of receiving military assistance from Ukrainian advisors. Now, for me, if you told me this a year ago and said that, look, there are Ukrainians active in Northwest Africa in the desert somewhere helping these Bedouins, and it's some sort of Ukrainian Lawrence of Arabia or St. John Philby situation, I wouldn't believe you. I'd spit out my coffee at laughing. But we literally saw Ukrainian drone operators flying drones into Aleppo, helping HTS and SNA forces, attack the Assad regime in late last year in December. So could there actually be Ukrainian special forces operating in Northwest Africa against Russia? Could this be a Russo-Ukrainian proxy war in the Sahel, in the deserts of Mali? And I mean, absolutely. And of course, we understand that these are probably not solely Ukrainians, most likely the CIA, British, who knows, maybe even French specialists, because we have to understand the French, they're still very upset at their former colonies being taken in the 1960s. Mauritania, for example, I believe 1960, they've gained independence from France, and Algeria, 1962, Mali, Burkina Faso, all these nations, of course, at one point, heavily reliant on France or former colonies. And of course, France greatly, this is the French, just as Venezuela is the backyard of the US, Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, Algeria, Mauritania. This is the influence zone of the French Foreign Legion, French Special Forces. France, even during its Catholic imperial period, has always ruled over these areas and influenced them very heavily. This is why the French language is spoken so broadly around the world, because, well, a lot of these African countries still speak French because of that imperial colonial history. So keep in mind, I think the French interests are here just as active as the Ukrainians. But given Macron's recent visit to the White House, his collaboration with Zelensky, I mean, potentially this could be a Tuareg joint French-Ukrainian operation trying to arm and train these rebellious sand Muslims to fight against the Mali government. And again, unfortunately for the Tuaregs, they're collaborating, at least in part, with a force which would greatly, most likely lead to their own destruction. The local ISIS, radical, Al-Qaeda-esque Muslims who, again, have been committing insane terror acts all over North Africa, which many of these acts don't even capture the news. But if these terrorist acts even occurred, for example, in European soil, these would be horrific. So we're talking about beheadings, of course, villages being cut out, suicide bombers, everything that we see from typical Islamic Sunni Muslim terrorism that's happening in the Sahel region. So it's a real war zone. It's a good thing that the Russians remain steadfast in Burkina Faso and Mali to sort of keep these two regimes afloat. And hopefully the same will happen in Venezuela. So very different regions of the world, again, divided by the Atlantic, but still zones which Russia needs to remain in if it wishes to sort of hold the globalist war machine from completely conquering, engulfing as much territory as it can before the world really does divide into these multipolar regions. I think this is almost like not a race for Africa in a way, but it is a race for like influence around the world before globalism settles down. It's who can control most of these countries and who can destroy a lot of local regimes, take as much sovereignty as possible before the world really kind of settles in. It's almost like lava flowing out of a volcano, and we see the globalists really rushing at these various locations. Unfortunately, I have to say that Donald J. Trump is, at the moment, in my eyes, still participating in that globalist regime model, opposed to what, for example, Professor Alexander Dugin recently said, what Trump is acting against the globalist interests. I think he's absolutely playing their game. He's working with them. So that's the current geopolitical outlook.
No, that was very prescient. I think, again, we have to recognize it is World War III. Every continent is involved, even Antarctica, I think, at a certain level. whether it's just the penguins or whether it's, the fight for relevance, and the Antarctic Treaty down there. So I think in general, we are very much in a worldwide conflict. North America is probably the current coolest region. But again, we've got U.S. drones flying over Mexico now. And, we even have potential, secession in Canada. And of course, the Trump-Putin summit in Alaska. The Americans are now opening up more and more of the Bering Strait and these northwest passages in the Arctic region, recognizing that Russia has an advantage there. So we're going to see potential Arctic conflict in the very, very near future. But speaking of Alaska and speaking of everything going on there, we have to transition over to church news. And the main story here, very unfortunate. It seems that Archbishop Alexei, who last week, or rather, I think it was on my stream, I gave him a B+, A- on his clarification that he issued on his meeting with Vladimir Putin. Unfortunately, since then, Metropolitan Tikhon, the head of the OCA, and Ukrainian sycophants within the Orthodox Church in America seem to have forced an apology out of the good Archbishop Alexei. And this is from the OCA website. His Beatitude Metropolitan Tikhon has received the following statement from His Eminence Archbishop Alexei concerning recent events that took place within the Diocese of Alaska. His Beatitude adds the following clarification. The encounter to which His Eminence Archbishop Alexei refers in this statement of apology was undertaken on his own initiative and was not authorized by the Holy Synod. The canonical tradition insists that a bishop do nothing without the knowledge of the Metropolitan. This meeting was arranged without my knowledge. His Eminence has taken responsibility for his actions, and I wish to affirm that they do not represent the official position of the OCA with respect to external relations. From the very beginning, the OCA has been among the first Orthodox churches to clearly and repeatedly condemn the aggression against Ukraine, which has caused the loss of countless lives, untold suffering, and the displacement of millions. We have consistently raised our voices against violence, prayed for peace in our liturgical services, and provided support for those displaced by the war. In all of my public statements, including during my primatial visit to Ukraine last year, I have expressed prayerful support for the Orthodox Church in America, for His Beatitude Metropolitan Onufry, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and the entire Ukrainian people. Together with my brother hierarchs in the Holy Synod, I renew my fervent appeal for the immediate cessation of hostilities and for peace to prevail so that reconciliation and healing may begin for all who have been afflicted by this tragic war. And then comes Archbishop Alexei's apology that was clearly forced out of him. Also, he talked about it. Metropolitan Tikhon talked about his visit to Ukraine. We'll talk about that later because, guess what he did right after that? He went and visited Patriarch Bartholomew. So not really cool. So here's from Archbishop Alexei. He says, I wish to express my sincere apology to those who have experienced pain, suffering, or confusion because of my actions in recent days. I am deeply sorry for the scandal that I have caused. My actions in no way indicate a change in the position of the OCA and our support for those suffering, as expressed in synodal documents. As Bishop of Sitka in Alaska, I serve as a member of the Holy Synod of the Bishops of the Orthodox Church in America under the presidency of His Beatitude Metropolitan Tikhon. As such, I adhere to the guidance and pastoral counsel of the Holy Synod concerning this tragic war, and I seek to lead the faithful of Alaska in prayer and works for mercy for all who suffer. The Diocese of Alaska is one of the dioceses of the Orthodox Church in America, an autocephalous church whose mission extends from the Arctic Circle to Central America and embraces many people, cultures, and languages. Last week, I greeted President Vladimir Putin during the summit at Anchorage in a peaceful spirit of hospitality after 3 days of diocesan-wide prayer for peace. Since then, I have heard from many who viewed the moment as a missed opportunity for a rebuke or demand for peace amid ongoing conflict and suffering. Again, I repeat to all who experience my actions as a cause for sorrow and confusion, I sincerely ask your forgiveness. I accept full responsibility for the confusion and pain my actions caused. Our church continually calls the faithful to prayer, to concrete works of mercy and the pursuit of peace and reconciliation for all who suffer. In Alaska, we have sought to bear witness to this by dedicating days of prayer, invoking the intercessions of the saints who labored in this land, that peace may be restored swiftly and mercy shown to all. I ask forgiveness of all whom my actions have wounded or troubled, especially those who have lost loved ones. May Christ, the Prince of Peace, swiftly and the bloodshed comfort the bereaved, return the displaced, and reconcile hearts in true love. Well, what an awful, awful thing, right? And I think that this is what I said in my stream when I said, if you even clarify, if you respond at all, if you give an inch, they're going to try to take a mile. And that's what happened. And the response, of course, is everyone was saying, I said this was terrible. I tweeted about it and people are like, well, he didn't get a blessing. So what are you talking about? It's like, are we papists now? Like, he's literally an archbishop in a diocese that's barely even connected to the rest of the Orthodox Church in America geographically. It's on the old calendar. They're not even on the same calendar as the rest of the OCA. So does Archbishop Alexei have to get a blessing every time he meets somebody in his diocese, every time he meets somebody that's in Alaska, which is his jurisdiction? This is just ridiculous. And sure, I recognize it was a big deal, but frankly, the meeting was so last minute. This idea that we have to go through this whole bureaucratic process. Look, you're making these papists arguments for them. And I think this ridiculous idea that he's literally an archbishop. He's not like an auxiliary bishop. Like, he is the primatial bishop of his diocese. Like, I don't understand what this argument that, does he need to just be on phone with Metropolitan Tikhon at all times? Like, why doesn't Metropolitan Tikhon just rule Alaska? Like, if that's what this is all about. And this is just again, this apology is going to solve nothing. None of the people who hate the bishops that are on a certain side of things are going to change their mind. This is obviously coerced out of the UOC USA, which is the EP Ukrainian churches in America, which are still canonical, but are probably the largest supporters of the schismatics outside of Ukraine itself. And unfortunately, again, this apology, like, who cares if people die in the war? That has nothing to do with meeting with Putin or expressing gratitude to an Orthodox ruler or the country that gave your diocese its faith, or even expressing goodwill, which in and of itself can go towards the cause of finding a peaceful solution. So this is just a true stain on the Orthodox Church in America, an embarrassment for Metropolitan Tikhon, an embarrassment for this autocephalous church in America. I mean, look, this is the kind of thing that makes you think that maybe America doesn't deserve an autocephalous, independent church, because of this type of nonsense. And if they're going to be this captured by nonsensical U.S. foreign policy and the whims of a radicalized, foolish Ukrainian minority within their midst, then I'm not super hopeful about the OCA. But I wanted to draw attention to, of course, Metropolitan Tikhon invoked his visit to Ukraine, where he concelebrated with Metropolitan Onufri, but he also went immediately afterwards to Constantinople to meet with Patriarch Bartholomew. And do you think he rebuked him for actually causing the schism, for directly supporting the persecution of the bishop he just concelebrated with? Absolutely not. And it's totally embarrassing. The OCA, Vladimir Putin is the leader of the country that gave the OCA its autocephaly. The Ecumenical Patriarchate doesn't even properly recognize the Orthodox Church in America's autocephaly, and Metropolitan Tikhon is still prostrating at them and shucking and jiving to their tune and doing whatever they want with this silly letter and forcing the good Archbishop Alexei to apologize for doing literally nothing wrong. So I could go off on this for a while, but it's an extremely unfortunate development.
Absolutely. And I think the strangest thing that we can sort of take away from this is the fact that there are these references to canonicity, for example, like, oh, well, it's not canonically correct to greet like a member of a visiting foreign state without the permission of the metropolitan, or to exchange icons. And it's a very bizarre thing. And I think our criticism was more about President Putin, for example, not prostrating himself or bowing before the archbishop and not receiving an Orthodox Christian blessing, right? Like, that was the actual criticism that should have been carried forth. The Archbishop Alexei should have said, well, why didn't President Putin receive a blessing from me? Instead, it's this, as you said, weird groveling before, again, Metropolitan Tikhon, his master. And I suppose I understand that in terms of that particular autocephaly and autonomy of the OCA, but clearly you do not need permission from the ruling hierarch to greet a member of a foreign state. That's just completely ludicrous. I don't know which canon he's speaking about necessarily. You do not need the permission of the leading hierarch to make every single decision or a micromanaging move, locally speaking. I mean, that's just completely absurd. And this wasn't even an important, the scope of things, right? This trip, geopolitically speaking, was exaggerated to no end, as if it would bring peace, even though the discussion was clearly about a regular ceasefire. So, if anything, this entire debacle in Alaska Anchorage was blown out of proportion, and we kind of, I think you especially, Conrad, predicted correctly that this would be essentially a nothing burger, and that the moving parts on the front line will determine peace in a lot more adequate fashion than the meeting of even President Putin and this hierarch and Donald J. Trump. And nevertheless, I think the absolute pressure on the Archbishop, it's very unfortunate that the OCA still retains this strange perspective that this war is somewhat fratricidal and both parties in the conflict are equal. And we come out and criticize the Russian Federation, we're required, but we can clearly see the Russian Federation is not abusing Orthodox Christian priests, bishops. In fact, the Russian side, if anything, is catechizing its people more so than the Ukrainian, which has banned Orthodox Christian clergy from even participating in, as we said, POW prisons. So prisoners of war, Russian prisoners of war in Ukrainian prisons are not allowed to go to Orthodox Christian churches. All they have access to is uniate clergymen, right? Or various schismatic Protestant pastors, or potentially even rabbis, but no Orthodox priests are active in Ukrainian prisons, especially war prisons. So this is, and like lest we talk about military clergy and other implementations across the board, Ukrainian military is very de-Christianized. Why isn't this being mentioned by the OCA? Can we have some equity at least? Can we have equal treatment? And maybe a classical sit down where we break down, okay, so which side in this particular conflict, and let's just say from 2014, since the entire Donetsk-Lugansk debacle, has been acting in a more Christian fashion. And if we're speaking about canons, right, and canon law, let's mention the canons about the Jews. and which side has been, for example, collaborating or even speaking with rabbis or pushing their agenda in each respective land. I mean, if we're really being courageous and if we're obviously higher hierarchs of the church, and if we're monastics and we're disconnected from the world in terms of our private property, why are we afraid to mention the fact that these Talmudic actors are killing hundreds, if not millions of people in Eastern Europe? Or is that agenda scarier than the death of hundreds of potentially hundreds of thousands of potentially Orthodox Christian people on the front lines? So mentioning the Talmudic tribe is much scarier. Of course, God forbid we offend these particular people in positions of power, than the conflict itself. I mean, it's just very bizarre, a lot of hypocrisy. I think if people want to mention canons, they need to just, firstly, I just want to see some courage in terms of actually addressing the issue and why the conflict began in the first place. For example, Igor Kolomoisky and all these other figures, and the fact that Zelensky himself is an active persecutor of orthodoxy, which I think Metropolitan Tikhon has correctly put. Like, he has expressed his support for Metropolitan Onufry of Kiev, but frankly, it's not enough. And we've said that even Metropolitan Onufry needs to do more in terms of actually addressing the conflict on the ground. If he wants to become a confessor of the faith, like the other metropolitans who are under him, and like the other bishops, even like Metropolitan Luke of Zaporozhye, a lot more needs to be said. That people need to hear the truth about the war in Ukraine, about who's propagating it and who's pushing it. This is not a conspiracy anymore. It's literally like basic history that will be taught in books in a generation or two. And, these people are participating in as actors and decision makers. So it's quite a shame that the fear before the Jew is actually much greater than other affairs. But speaking of, persecution of the Orthodox Church, there's been active desecration of Orthodox Christian relics in the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra. Some absolutely obscene things have been taking place. For example, we knew that the Ukrainian Ministry of Culture employees have been actively investigating the relics of the saints within the Kiev-Pechersk caves. And just recently, for example, and despite the fact that they've been digging around in those caves and uncovering and opening up the sarcophagi for about over a few months now, easily, they've decided to simply take the sarcophagi out of the caves. And where? Well, if you think about the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra complex, there are these parklands adjacent to it, sort of between the churches and cathedrals, where people, I suppose, where it's just a beautiful sort of landscape. They would take these coffins out of the caves, and these are relics of saints, bones, bodies, incorrupt relics, which are hundreds, some of them thousands of years old, like Saint Nestor the Chronicler, right? This is the first Russian historian who wrote down the lives of the early Russian saints. His body is over 900 years old. They take these relics out of the coffins outside in the parkland, and literally without gloves, they just lay the bones out on the dirt. I mean, it's just my understanding is that this is clearly done for demoralization purposes. The fact that it's even filmed as well is very clearly shown. And, these people aren't wearing gloves. They're not even treating the relics and the bones of the saints in a way that is even remotely even archaeologists, of course, conduct themselves with more respect towards ancient items of value. So it's just really concerning. Even the gear these people are wearing, they're just wearing like jeans and like regular sneakers and walking around trying not to trample on the bones of ancient saints. I mean, it's very concerning. And some of these coffins, Conrad, they were taken out of the caves and simply placed in some of the former residential apartments of the monks, just in the hallways. So the hallways are full of just these wooden coffins, which themselves are hundreds of years old. And of course, what they contain, the vestments, the bones, the relics of the saints, 400, 500, 600, 700 years old, because it's generations of saints that have been buried in these caves. And again, treated with huge disrespect. And these weird bottles of hand sanitizer standing everywhere. I mean, and look, we should just have to treat this with the utmost seriousness, because frankly, there's been a lot of relics of the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra that have been lost over the ages, especially, just think about it. Saint Alexandra, for example, the wife of Saint Vladimir of Kiev, Saint Boris and Gleb's relics. We do have fragments of Saint Vladimir of Kiev's relics remaining, fortunately enough, today. But the relics of, for example, Saint Theodosius, right, one of the first monks of the Kiev-Pechersk caves, they were destroyed by the Mongols. Saint Olga of Kiev, who we all know, right? Saint Olga, her life, we venerate, one of the first lady female saints of the Rus, of Russia. Her relics were destroyed by the Mongols. There's no expectation that these relics will be kept safe. The Ukrainians may destroy them in part or in totality if they, of course, abuse them or just leave them unguarded. I mean, there could be, I mean, we saw the protesters outside of the Kiev-Pechersk caves a year and a half ago, people dressed in costumes of Satan. There are crazy people walking around, draft dodgers, just psychopaths who could enter into the Lavra, enter into these essentially unmanned areas and potentially attack or desecrate some of these holy objects. So incredibly concerning. And just keep in mind, even when the Third Reich occupied Kiev, they did not desecrate the holy places as much as the Ukrainian regime is doing now. And how much rhetoric has been pushed against the Third Reich and the evil National Socialists, the Nazis, by various members of the Orthodox Christian community over the last 80 years, right, since the end of the Second World War. And yet this regime of Zelensky is doing more against the church than the Third Reich has, at least in the land of Ukraine. So just keep that in mind. But we're not seeing the same level of outrage. And again, for whatever reason, President Putin is withholding the Oreshnik strike on the presidential palace of Kiev for some reason. And you know, there's all kinds of questions. I'm not saying that vengeance is the correct way out of this, but I think the church persecution issue is the number one concern, at least for Orthodox Christians. I think for most Russians on the front lines, those recently catechized, baptized, those reading the lives of saints, and then realizing, hold on, we're actually fighting to restore orthodoxy in this once Christian land, or at least to restore proper adoration of the relics. And just recall, last year on the 17th of May, 2024, the Kiev regime shut down mobile and, essentially internet in an entire suburb of Kiev, sent in bulldozers, sent in cranes, trucks, and destroyed the Church of the Times, in which the Theotokos appeared in 2006, one of the most vivid and awe-inspiring apparitions of the Holy Mother of God, Theotokos, appeared in 2006 during, I believe it was either Holy Tuesday or Holy Thursday after Easter, in this church, and the Ukrainians destroyed it last year. And I mean, what else needs to be said, really? The Church of the Times is broken, completely demolished. The Ukrainians have destroyed it last year. It's been 13, 14 months since then. And at this point, we just have to kind of view this Ukrainian regime as simply terroristic. And in relation to the Orthodox Church, there has not been another regime besides perhaps that of ISIS. And yes, the Israelis are trying to catch up in terms of actually, catching up on the persecution in the Holy Land and in adjacent areas like Lebanon and Syria in terms of trying to kill as many Christians as possible. But the Ukrainians and the Zelensky, this new Khazarian regime, is certainly at the moment at the forefront. And I have to quote Father Slobodan, a Montenegrin Orthodox Christian priest of the Serbian Church. He said that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church right now is the most persecuted local Orthodox Church anywhere in the world. And I have to agree with Father Slobodan. So we have to respect our Serbian, Montenegrin wise brothers who have always been allied with the Russians for a long time. But he's completely right.
Now, the Ukrainians are leading the pack when it comes to church persecution. And not only is that staying in Ukraine, but big story here. This is from Ortho Christians. Schismatics invade Czech-Slovak church territory, violating their own tomos. The schismatics of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine have invaded the territory of yet another local Orthodox church. Vasil Varic, Ukrainian ambassador to the Czech Republic, announced yesterday the establishment of the first chaplaincy mission of the OCU in the Czech Republic, set to operate in Brno, with the first service planned for August 23rd, according to a report from the Union of Orthodox Journalists. That's today when we're recording this. So Lord have mercy. This move directly violates the terms of the tomos granted by the OCU by Patriarch Bartholomew in 2019, according to which the OCU has no right to establish parishes or church structures outside the territory of Ukraine. The Czech Republic is the ecclesiastical territory of the Orthodox Church of the Czech lands in Slovakia, a fully recognized autocephalous local Orthodox church. Significantly, the Czech-Slovak Church doesn't recognize the schismatic OCU as a canonical body with the majority of other local Orthodox churches. Thus, any OCU activity in the Czech Republic is not only an invasion, but a further act of schism. While the ambassador's announcement states that the goal of the chaplaincy mission is to care for Ukrainian faithful in the Czech Republic, the Czech-Slovak Church has been providing spiritual, material, and humanitarian support to Ukrainian refugees since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. Parishes throughout the Republic hold services in Ukrainian or with Ukrainian chants, provide charitable assistance, and create a space for integrating Ukrainian believers into the life of the local parish. It is perhaps no surprise that the OCU has established a mission in Brno, where Bishop Isaiah Slaninka is the ruling hierarch. Bishop Isaiah has been troublesome for the church for several years. He was consecrated in 2015 by decision of the Constantinople hierarchs Emmanuel of Gaul and Arsenios of Austria, without the blessing or recognition of his beatitude Metropolitan Rostislav of the Czech-Slovak Holy Synod, in order to create an alternative synod in the church. Constantinople also interfered in the elections that saw Metropolitan Rostislav ascend to the primatial throne in 2014 and refused to acknowledge him as the canonical primate until the Patriarchate was forced to reconcile with Czech-Slovak Church to assure that it would attend 2016's Crete Council. It was then that Bishop Isaiah was accepted as a hierarch of the church as part of the reconciliation. Bishop Isaiah caused multiple controversies in late 2019. In November, he celebrated with the Ukrainian schismatics in Kiev in defiance to the stance of the Holy Synod and the warning of his primate, Metropolitan Rostislav. That same month, it was reported that Bishop Isaiah was cooperating with Constantinople to establish a monastery and legal association in the Czech Republic without the blessing or even knowledge of the Czech-Slovak Holy Synod, which later strongly condemned this invasion by Constantinople. Bishop Isaiah also concelebrated with defrocked clerics from the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America's Slavic Vicariate. He's talking about Alexander Belia and those clowns. This is not the first instance of the OCU violating its tomos by establishing structures outside Ukraine. Ortho-Christian has previously reported on its encroachments into Slovenia, which is Serbian church territory, as well as Poland. The OCU also operates a structure covering America, Canada, Australia, and Japan, all in violation of its own tomos. So, very unfortunate development here. Obviously, this Bishop Isaiah figure is someone we've talked about on the show in the past. Seems like a pretty odious agent of Zog. So keep the Czech-Slovak Church in your prayers. It is a wonderful, one of the smaller autocephalous local churches, but a wonderful place where there is deep Orthodox heritage. So keep them in your prayers. These schismatics, they know no bounds, quite literally, based on what's going on here. But the other persecution news is coming out of the Holy Land in Jerusalem. This is the Middle Eastern Council of Churches has issued a strong condemnation of Israeli authorities' decision to freeze the bank accounts of the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Jerusalem. In its statement, it said, regarding the occupation authorities' freezing of the bank accounts of the Orthodox Patriarchate in Jerusalem, imposing heavy taxes on its properties and assaulting some of its properties, the council describes the action as an assault on its parishioners and on the people of Palestine as a whole. Whatever this group is, I like them, that they call the Israelis the occupation authorities instead of their fake name. The council states that the freezing of accounts paralyzes the ability of church institutions to function normally and serve the people and prevents aid from reaching at a time they are most in need of it. The statement notes that this phase of financial pressure comes after decades of direct attacks on and confiscation of patriarchal property in more than one location in Palestine, with the target being the Christian presence and the Palestinian presence in general in the land of Palestine, the land of the incarnation, crucifixion, resurrection, and the launching of the message of salvation. The council, which has been preaching and working for justice and peace since its founding half a century ago, calls on the international community and ecumenical bodies to demand the implementation of international agreements and respect for international humanitarian law, and to exert the necessary pressure to dissuade the occupying forces from carrying out these aggressive and destructive actions. The Middle East Council of Churches includes the Orthodox churches of Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, and Cyprus, as well as Oriental Catholic and Protestant churches. So, everyone is still keeping their eyes on the debanking of Jerusalem Patriarchate, but as the debanking occurs, this is from Ortho-Christian, the Jerusalem Patriarch, they celebrate the Transfiguration Feast on Mount Tabor. This says, for the third consecutive year, Israeli police imposed strict limitations on pilgrim access to Mount Tabor for the Orthodox celebration of the Transfiguration of Christ, citing security concerns as thousands of faithful were prevented from ascending the holy mountain. The Patriarchate of Jerusalem celebrated the Feast of the Transfiguration on Tuesday, August 19th, at the site where Jesus Christ revealed his divine glory to the disciples Peter, James, and John. However, the celebration took place under restrictive measures that significantly reduced attendance, according to Orthodoxia news agency. According to a statement from the Israeli Police Northern District Commander, Simon Ben Shabu, mass pilgrimages were prohibited on the grounds that organizers had not taken required safety measures. Sources in Israel suggest the restrictions were also influenced by the recent resignation of the Interior Ministry representative responsible for organizing official religious events and issuing permits. However, as the Patriarch said last year, this was not an isolated incident, but only another in a long line of moves against the freedom of worship of Christians in the Holy Land. Despite the limitations, His Beatitude, Patriarch Theophilos of Jerusalem, presided over an outdoor all-night vigil on the eve of the feast, concelebrated by His Eminence Metropolitan Aristarchos of Constantina and Metropolitan Makarios of Ptolemais Acre. The service included representatives from the Moscow and Romanian Patriarchates, along with the Arabic, Russian, and Romanian-speaking priests. In his homily, the Patriarch emphasized the theological significance of Christ's transfiguration as both a revelation of divine glory and a prefiguration of the resurrection. Christ partially unveiled his divine nature as he willed and revealed unto his disciples who knew him the God dwelling within him. He had preached, quoting St. John Chrysostom through St. Gregory Palamas. So there was a celebration, but unfortunately, the restrictions, they were not able to have as many worshipers there. And as usual, the Israelis made sure, again, things went off with a hitch, not without a hitch. So unfortunate developments. Please keep the church and the Holy Land in your prayers, as well as the persecuted in Ukraine, as well as the persecuted hierarchs elsewhere. I'm talking, Metropolitan Tychicus, Metropolitan Neophytos. Be sure to keep these, real heroes of World War now in your prayers. Very important, because they are very important to us. But with all of that, I think we are here well past 2 hours, so it's time to land this plane. I want to encourage everybody to check us out at Substack, worldwarnow.co. Get behind that paywall to hear all of our episodes. We have a recent economics episode with Gennady that came out this week. Check out last week's episode with Steve Su, a deep dive on China, Taiwan, one of my favorite episodes we've done in a long time. You also get access to deep dive interviews with Patrick Lancaster, frontline journalists in Ukraine, Andrei Afanasyev, other major Russian patriotic figures, as well as Father Peter Heers, Father John Whiteford, Abbot Trifon, major interviews about Orthodox saints and even those that haven't been canonized yet. So be sure to get behind that paywall. Check us out, worldwarnow.co. Like the episode on Substack, like the video on YouTube, wherever you're listening. Follow us on X at @WorldWarNow_. Follow me on X at GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri at WWN Host. Follow us on Discord. The link is down below. We want to get more people hanging out in our Discord server. It's getting pretty active these days. So if you want to hang out with us and other World War Now patriots, be sure to check that out. Obviously, find us on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, wherever podcasts are found. You can find us on Telegram at World War Now Telly, 24/7 news feeds. So again, worldwarnow.co. That's our Substack home base. Find us there. Thank you all so much for listening here to the end of the episode. Dimitri, I'll leave you with the last word.
Thank you, Conrad. Amazing. And yes, we will have another article dropping as well in the next few days. Most likely you've already seen it. Again, warning for those who haven't read it, it is a little bit graphic in terms of we discuss some pretty interesting and I would say uncensored esoteric material, but still related to, I think, the Orthodox Church and our particular Christian tradition and exactly who its enemies are in Eastern Europe. So quite relevant, I think, to what is happening at the moment in the Ukrainian-Russo conflict. But thank you very much for all of the supporters, people who've liked the episode, shared it, pushed us through the algorithm. We always appreciate your support. Thank you for listening. God bless.